Now we are ready to start. So good morning, everybody, and welcome to Derrynane. And as I say it, the sun is coming out on this beautiful autumn morning. I'm going to start on a very poignant note. All of us here this morning and throughout the community wish to pass on our deepest sympathies to Sean, Alice and Mark, their partners and their children, and the loss of their beloved Stella. That funeral will be happening during the course of this morning. And it's even sadder, of course, because just 6 weeks ago today, to be precise, they lost their darling mum, Helen, a dear friend of mine, a childhood friend. And I just want them to know how much we're thinking of them all today. And that is all we can do, of course, is remember and think of them with love. I also think of Deirdre and all the Moran family here who are neighbours and dear friends of the family. So you're all in our thoughts, very much so. And may they rest in peace in the place they love so much, Derrynane. The parish as a whole, since we last met and gathered here, have lost a lot of people this year. And we're all deeply saddened by it, and we want to pass our sympathies on to the whole community, to all their loved ones and all their families. We empathise and sympathise with you all. I always say, with grief comes gratitude. We have to be filled with deep gratitude that they were in the lives of the community, and each and every one of them contributed so much to the community. Yesterday and today marked, as I looked around on both days and saw all of you who have returned every year for the past 10 years. And some of you, as you reminded me yesterday, go back to over 30 years ago when you also gathered to remember Daniel O'Connell and his great legacy. We gathered to listen, to discuss, to talk, and to share and to debate. And most of all, I would hope too, to laugh. To all the wonderful speakers yesterday, today, to all the great chairs, I say thank you. We have an awful lot to be grateful for, and I would hope that today, as we are in Derrynane, in this very beautiful place, we take time to remember how much we have to be grateful for with all that's happening throughout the world. I, in particular, have always been grateful for the fact that the O'Connell family gave this wonderful place to the state. I remember as a child walking from school, and they were starting to do the works here. So it opened in 1967, but what a gift they gave to us. A gift that everyone can enjoy. And I know that the people who visit here, be it for people who can only perhaps afford to come to Derrynane for a day or for a week or for 2 weeks, it soothes their spirit and soothes their souls. And they all leave, just like O'Connell said, inspired and renewed in their lives. So I thank them all, and I thank in particular all the O'Connell family present who have come every single year to the school. And I know, it's very easy to say, sure, but to give that much to us, to come from all over and be present means so much to Mirish, myself and the whole committee. And we thank you for your presence, and we're delighted you're with us. I don't know why I'm so nervous this morning, but I am. I think it's Mirish. Or maybe it's getting older. The OPW look after this site. And to Chris and Adrian, Anne-Marie, Gerard, Declan, who continuously tell the story of O'Connell, I say thank you. But more than that, Chris O'Neill, when we were trying to set up the school in 2013, Chris had just been appointed in charge of Derrynane and Garnish. And he was just so enthusiastic about it and gave us so much support and has always given us so much support, which again is challenging because we take over the house for the day. he looks after everything, the sound, and Marie and himself. There's so little I have to do now that I really couldn't be more grateful to them, because it's not easy. And the same for Deirdre and all her team in the tea rooms. We change what they do for a whole day, and they open their arms to us, and they're so welcoming and so kind and do such a brilliant job. So I say a huge thank you. A huge thank you to Deirdre and her team for the beautiful food they provide, and again for facilitating us at every level. We're very grateful. To James, who looks after sound, you're a constant, you're reliable, you're wonderful. I know I can tell all the speakers when they're asking what they need to bring, say very little, a USB key, James will look after you. So James, thank you. And the recordings that we're so privileged now to have. Whatever about, the past, when you look back, we didn't have that privilege, but we have it now. So can you imagine listening to the wonderful speakers of yesterday, the wonderful talk, the Dan O'Connell lecture that Owen gave on reconciliation. Can you imagine listening back to all those talks, and Paddy and all the wonderful speakers yesterday? Now today isn't live because of internet, but hopefully we'll get that sorted in the years to come. But we are recording it, and by Thursday at the latest, we'll hopefully have it up online. So if any of you don't get an email with a code, send me an email and I'll make sure you have it. I would like to thank Christy, who takes the photographs these last few years. They're wonderful. They're a delight. We didn't get them up till late last year. That was partly my fault. But if you have time sometime, go on. You'll see some great, great shots. And most of them with people laughing, which gives me great joy. To Linda, who looks after our website, I say a big thank you. She really makes it all so easy, and being able to book online makes it easy for everyone. To the Ring of Kerry Hotel yesterday, to Leonard Demante and Stephen, the welcome we got, to all the people who live there, all our visitors from Ukraine, I want to say a huge thank you for welcoming us in yesterday morning, and to see the transition, as I said yesterday, that has gone from just a place to stay to an absolute home is wonderful to see. And to the people of Carsaveen, and indeed to Cara Daniel, it's wonderful to see that people have been able to settle in happily and live a new life in wonderful surroundings in Ivara. And we hope, of course, most of all, as we did last year, that peace will come to their country soon. To Kerry County Council, to Moira Morell and all her team, Angela McCallan, Niamh O'Sullivan, you're a constant in your support as well, and we deeply appreciate it. Without you, we couldn't hold it. It is expensive, but we just about break even every year, and of course that is thanks to the generosity of you all. To SuperValue, to Dermot and Siobhan Walsh, who are here again today, really, I say a huge thank you, because unlike the big establishments, the OPW and Kerry County Council, I know you're called on continuously by everyone in local communities for every event. So to back us every year, we really, really, just a big thank you, Dermot and Siobhan. There's one man I'd really like to pay tribute. I thought he'd be here for the weekend, but he's not, and that's John Griffin of Kerry County Council, the tourism officer for over the last 30 years. John, I knew before, I know John for the last 30 years, and 10 years ago he challenged us in the year of the gathering, came down and said, would you not set up the Dan O'Connell School again? And I can tell you now, I resisted for a while. I thought, really, God? And he insisted, and I'm so glad he did, because we've had such wonderful occasions every year. But to John, he's given a wealth of his time to the county and achieved so much. I want to wish him and Therese a wonderful retirement, and to extend our gratitude to him. He wasn't able to be here, but I know he'll watch it in a week's time or so. I just want to say, John, how deeply we appreciate all you did for our county, and I know you'll continue to participate in many ways. So thank you, John. Our committee, what can I say about them? They're a joy to work with. We have great fun. We work hard, and I suppose everyone gives of their time very freely, and they're all available. I'd like to thank Michael Prendergast yesterday, who comes on annually to help us. Sean Gallivan is here today, a little late, but he's here, and we very much appreciate it. To Ruth, to Christy, to Phil, what can I say? They're a joy. And of course, The school could never be held any year without Mirish. As he said yesterday, he's very humble and will definitely not want this praise. But Mirish, we know you put tireless work into creating a wonderful programme for you all, and I just want to say how grateful we are. That's me at the end. Again, I thank all the speakers, everyone who's given so much to us over the last 10 years. Your support, if I was thinking, of all the people, filling the 2 days on an October weekend is a big ask. And for all of you to come, full of kindness, full of generosity, just thank you. Thank you very much, because that makes our work so worthwhile. So I hope you have a wonderful day with us. I hope you enjoy it all. And as I say, that you look back and have good memories of another beautiful weekend in Ivara. So thank you. Now, you have a wonderful morning of speakers ahead and a wonderful day. Judith can't be with us because sadly she got ill. So that's the last speaker. So she picked, we were glad that was the slot that we're not missing. So we send Judith our best, and she is, I know, tuning in. But it gives me great pleasure now to introduce a neighbour and a friend who is now the biodiversity officer for the council and who I actually come in contact with regularly at work. I can't speak highly enough of Eleanor Turner. Her passion for what is the most important role is just unbelievable. And I know she will be a huge asset to our county and will lead us all in wonderful works in the next decades, I hope. So Eleanor, gives me great pleasure to introduce you to the crowd.
Thanks, Mary. That was a very lovely introduction. I feel like she's set a very high bar for me there, which might be a little bit hard to get to, but I suppose in my role, I have incredible support from both the communities all over Kerry, from within the County Council itself, and obviously through community friends, neighbours, everything. So it's been fantastic to step into the role. I'm also a PhD candidate with Smart Lab in UCD, and I'm supported by a local organisation called Living Ivara through that process. So I'd like to thank them as well. Without their support, I don't think I would be standing here in front of you today. So it's fantastic to be able to give a little back to this community. Now, I promised the speakers I wouldn't harp on too much because they have much more interesting things to say than I do, so I'm not going to take up any more time. It's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Aoife Granville as our first speaker today. So she's going to do a talk on music, community and identity in the Wren tradition, which is a very local tradition here. Aoife is a member of the Arts Council, and she's also served as a member of the External Advisory Board to both the Vice President and President of UCC. And she's also an amazing flute and fiddle player, so I hope that maybe we will hear some music too. So over to you, Aoife. Thank you very much.
Constantia Vermaiden, it's privilege or leva hansa. It's a great privilege to be here with you. And I was just thinking, well, first of all, to apologise for the delay, because the delay was my fault in the tech. So thanks, James and Portia, for helping me out there. It's such a great privilege to be here this morning. And I was thinking the cheek of me coming and talking about how brilliant Dingle is now in the beautiful Derrynane. But anyway. I'm just going to talk to you a little bit about the Ran tradition, and I'm from the town of Dingle, and it's not that people from here, I don't know how the Ran is here or how it has survived or whatever, but maybe you'll tell me about that later. It's not that it hasn't survived anywhere else, of course, but the Ran in Dingle it's just unique in the way it survived. So I'll give you a little bit of rundown on the tradition and a little bit about how it has impacted, I guess, on community identity and how it is today. And you all know where Dingle is, I'm sure, across the bay. But when it comes to the Ran, we break into 4 parts of the town. So John Street here, I'm from John Street, so we're obviously the best group in the town. But there's one in Goat Street, the Wood there on the water side, and the Green and Gold. So there's 4 different groups. So if you're born on one side of town, you stick with your group. And there's great debate if people marry from different parts of the town, and which ran the kids might go with. It, I know it doesn't sound too serious, it's not life or death, but it feels like it's sometimes coming up to December. But calendar custom generally in Dingle is very important, and outside the Rans Day, which is the 26th of December, we do different, I like to say we're healthily obsessed with marching around the town at various times of the year, and in particular, I guess the Paddy's Morning Parade is very important to us at 6 a.m. So we do that. It's the earliest parade in the country, and we beat Achill by an hour. So they start at 7, and lately we've starting at 5 to 6, just in case they get notions about starting at 6. But through the year, like, we do different marches, and they're led by one band, which is the fife and drum band. And like in a lot of places, I'm not sure what marching bands were like here, but especially from the 1800s, the mid-1800s on, with movements like the temperance movement and all like that, there were a lot of marching bands, and the traditional marching bands in Dingle remain very strong. So the Dingle Fife and Drum Band today, which previously would have been a pipe band, and there was brass and reeds, they lead they lead the parades through the year. There you see in 1914 we had a pipe band, and actually the guy on the triangle and one of the drummers there, descendants of them are the drummers in the bands today. So there's a kind of a hierarchy. If you're a Kennedy or a Scanlon or a Healy, you'll get a drum before a Granville or whatever. So the sort of families that would be associated with some of that stuff that goes back quite a while. And the CBS, the Christian Brothers School, had would have fed into those town bands as well over the years. So mostly boys, all boys until the 1990s in the town band. And the guy in the front there, this is from 1959, leads the fife and drum band today as well. So there's a great sense of continuity, I guess, in that. And this is a more recent picture of the band. We got very fancy and got jackets about 10 years ago there. So, and it's about half and half women and men today. So that's the fife and drum band through the year. But when it comes to the Ran, then on St. Stephen's Day, we break into those 4 kind of quarters, and there would be, I would say, a healthy sense of rivalry between the 4 groups. And some of you will be familiar with the tradition of Wren Boys, and there's similar traditions of mumming and rhyming around the country. And basically, all of those traditions, there's a bit of procession or parading involved. The masquerade or disguise is important. There's collection of money, of course, and it's really just a celebration. And the collection of money over the years has become a lot more PC. I mean, it's all giving away to charity now, obviously, within the town of Dingle, and with any of the Ran groups around the country. But it would have been spent on a party in previous times, you know. And the idea of the wren hunt, I mean, there wouldn't have been a wren hunted, or little droline or a wren in living memory in Dingle, as far as I could find out. But the idea of the hunt was, you know, a sort of a payback, and the wren is a kind of an interesting bird in folklore. And there's a story, I'm sure some of you have heard that, about how the wren became the king of all birds. And because it's such a small, unassuming little bird, it always had to be kind of cute or glick to get by. So it became the king of all birds through being a little bit devious and slown, I guess, and hiding on the eagle's back. When they had decided the bird that would fly closest to the sun would become the king, the wren says, I'm not going to manage that. So he hid under the eagle's wing, and as soon as the eagle got as close to the sun as he could, he popped out, so he was the king, and all the other birds weren't happy with that. So that's why he's hunted. And of course, there's an adaptation of that in the Christian thing with St. Stephen as well. So it's hunted, and some of you are familiar with that verse, the wren, the king of all birds, St. Stephen's Day was caught in the furs. And actually, today as well, I won't play that, but there's a Lancome, even the folk band Lancome have written around the wren as well. So it's the wren is kind of, I suppose, still a source of inspiration as well today in contemporary music even. So Steve McDonough, who wrote a lovely little book on the Ran in the 1980s, describes it as an explosion of light, colour and boisterous exuberance in the midst of winter's gloom. And it happens on the 26th of December, and that would be like midwinter, you know, it was back to Celtic times. Midwinter around that time was a very important time, like midsummer, to celebrate, and arguably, I suppose, even more important than summertime, to keep people's, I suppose, spirits up. And Derrynane Chneda, who wrote a wonderful thesis on this back in 2003, says about it, therefore, one could say that the tradition of the Ran is the heart of the community during the Christmas period in West Kerry. It makes the identity of the place apparent to the townspeople. So, down to the nitty-gritty then, there's the 4 groups, as I said, the Green and Gold, the Shraudone, the Goat Street and the Quay. And the title, I often use the title, We Never Died a Winter Yet, and that's a sort of a catch cry that started in John Street but is used by the 4 groups now because it's an unbroken tradition. In living memory, up till COVID, and I guess that was the 2020, where we tried to play a tune on the street, but there wasn't a parade. So we never died a winter yet, and the devil himself wouldn't kill us in the summer. Is the full thing. And here is the Shraudone group. So I'll just explain a little bit about it as I'm going along. The Green and Gold, they have very fancy straws. The rest of us kind of say they're a bit too modern, really. They're very embellished straw hats, fabulous hats. And here's the Goat Street. And, I forgot the K. So there's a captain in each of the groups. And you have the hobby horse to the front, and the hobby horse is kind of an interesting sort of a thing in that it's not something we see much in Wren traditions and Christmas traditions in Ireland. It's actually something that's very associated with May Day rituals, and you see it a lot in traditions in places like Padstow, Cornwall, and even in parts of Galicia and Asturias and Spain and different things, but to do with fertility and all of that. But the hobby horse, we kind of think it probably came in. Dingle would have been a very important port back in the 1500s, a lot of trade with the UK, a lot of trade with Spain, that maybe there was some sharing, but it's kind of unusual in how it works. It's sort of makeshifty in lots of ways. You have your hobby horse head, and it's a big, heavy wooden frame that's really hard to carry. And I don't know if that'll play that video there. If it does, you'll see. Oh no, it doesn't. But the jaws kind of chop all the time, and it leads the parade through. And this is the head of the Green and Gold hobby horse. I don't know if you can see that, but there's a nice set of false teeth there, and it says bad breath. And a former captain of the Green and Gold rank, I won't say his name, left his false teeth to the Green and Gold Ran. About 15 years ago, he also left them money for a party, and he left strict instructions to put the teeth into the hobby horse, so there'd be a bit of him out on the Ran every year. So we get a bit of fun out of that. And the straw suits are the traditional disguise, I guess, and the making of the straws is really, I suppose now it happens kind of maybe a couple of weeks before the Ran, so maybe early December, and it's a real community event. And I guess for us growing up in Dingle, it was something we were always around from when we were young, so the older generation would have gotten us involved in some way or another from a young age. And I don't know if anyone's ever made a straw hat or been involved even in the biddy and the similar traditions. My only job, or the only thing I'm allowed to do, is kind of sort through the straw and plait. So we're often brought in for plaiting the hats at the end. But you see, like, to make a hat here on the left, you've maybe 4 people involved in that process. It's a lovely event to be involved in. And here, health and safety risk on the left, obviously. But the suits of the Dingle, these are the Shraudone Ran boys. So you have your hat, your top, and your bottom, really. And this man, John Joe, comes from New York every year. He's from John Street, but he comes home just for the Ran, really. He's a wonderful man. And so the suit they're made every year, generally. They're not made to last. And you see as they go along here, you lose half the straw during the day. So the parades start around midday and they go on till midnight, we'll say, if the weather's good. So in that time, if it's raining especially, they kind of disintegrate, and the town is full of straw for weeks afterwards. And a lot of the pubs and that would find it very hard to get rid of the oats. But the idea is that they're made each year. Some of the rhyming traditions and mumming traditions in other parts of the country would make some of their masks with wicker and willow and stuff to last. So it's a little bit different like that. And you see here on the left, that's a Green and Gold hat. So there's differences in how people make the hats through the town as well. So, and as I kind of alluded to, there's a bit of debate over, what's traditional and what's not amongst a lot of the straw makers. But the Green and Gold hats are really beautiful, and there's a huge amount of effort that goes into them. So in terms of disguise, I guess people have different attitudes towards it, but the colours of each Ran group, so you know, the 4 groups, I suppose, coming up to Christmas even now, what we see is that it's like a GA club or a sporting club. The colours of each street become more visible. So there's, we generally try and get on our street blue and white lights, Christmas lights for everything. So if anyone finds in Pennies or Duns or wherever, blue and white anything, there's a text goes around to get, and red and white in one part of town and green and gold in the other. So you start to see this sort of 4 kind of sets of colours within the town. And on the day itself, like generally speaking, like a lot of people now would wear the face paint, but once you're showing the colours of your group, that's kind of the important thing. And then people go to all sorts of rounds. So these are some of the Dingle football team as the Spider-Men. There was about 30 of them. Every year they would go as something together, and we don't know what they're going to dress up as until the morning. It's usually something topical, whatever they get their hands on disguise-wise. This is them from years ago when Osama was on the run. So it's a long time ago, probably around, probably around 2005 or 2006, and they all even have the same gloves, if you see, and everything. So that was, it's nearly 20 years ago. The following year they went as King Kongs, because the King Kong film was out. So whatever's in the news, you know, and topical, that's a big carnival thing, I think, universally. But they collected for the hospice and raised a lot of money. But they would also then not take off the masks, you know, for the day. And like the pubs will always have loads of straws because people aren't taking off the masks. And a lot of the fellas in particular will have a squeaky voice, so they won't be recognised. So people take it very seriously, not getting recognised as well. And you had the Sugar Pups, and that's one, I don't know if anyone saw them all queuing for the ATM, but Joe.ie had picked that up. That's just before COVID, that sort of thing. So you have a lot of, outside of the 4 main groups who would be dressed in the straws and the colours, you have like groups of friends or the GA teams or whatever that will go together, and probably around September, you know, start going, what will we do this year? They keep it a secret. They'll order their costumes, and it's a bit of crack, I guess. And most of the time, like, you won't find out who someone is, actually, if they've been picking at you or anything on the Rand's Day. It's all part of it, I suppose, the fun. And that's new with the Obamas. And there's a lot of Donald Trumps in that as well around at the moment. But here's the Shroud Ran here playing, I don't know if that will play, would that, the audio, maybe not, I don't have it's okay, I'll play it to you in a second. So basically, through the day, the groups will march around the town, and there's specific routes that each group follows. And one of the big parts of the day is a visit to the community hospital. And in 2010, the site, I don't know, if you're familiar with Dingle, you know there's an old hospital, but the hospital moved to a completely other part of town, which caused absolute chaos for the RAM groups, because we had followed the same route around the town for however long, in living memory, I guess. So it's only actually after settling now, you know, about 13 years later, the routes. But the visit to the hospital is really important, and a lot of people in the hospital would have been part of RAN groups, you know, over the years. So it was particularly great to be back there this year after COVID, to be able to go back into the hospital. It meant a lot to the patients and to the RANs, I think. And we try and meet as well along the way. This is 3 of the RAN groups meeting and playing a few tunes together. So I often, I suppose, talk about, especially in the last 20 years, I think, the impact of the tradition on community identity in the town. And because of the unbrokenness of the tradition, like when I would talk to a lot of groups that are reviving these traditions in other parts of the country, they find it very hard to get young people involved, for example, which we're very lucky that we don't have that problem. People just don't even think about it. The kids just all get involved in the RAN, and that's what you do if you're from Dingle. And about 15 years ago, on the Dingle GAA jersey, this was adapted on the back. So you see the little wren bird and Old Comrades written underneath it, which is one of the tunes that we play in the tradition. And I'm going to play the tune for you. And it's a tune we use to commemorate and one we use to celebrate, I guess. So if someone passes away, it's the last tune we play for them at the grave, which sounds kind of mad, drums and whistles playing, but it's a kind of a real towny send-off, I guess, and also to celebrate. And it's also sort of an anthem of for the GA team, which I'll show you a clip of in a second. So I'll just play. It's just a jig, that's played in other parts of the country as well. And in Donegal, it's known as I Love You Not and I Care For You Not, which is a terrible name. I mean, very sad altogether. But we prefer Old Comrades. So I'll just play it through and then I'll show you a clip of the football verse. Okay, and then I need to Thanks for being so kind, there's no need. But in recent years, that's what the football team chant. The second part of that tune is what they chant when they win a match. So you always know if you hear that late at night, instead of championes, that chant, it's kind of our championes. And luckily enough, Dingle won the first county championship there a couple of weeks ago. And I have a little clip of the celebration afterwards. And you'll hopefully hear the same tune. I think, will this play or... I play it. So on and so forth. So it's interesting that is, so there's a clear sort of a link, I suppose, that and it's wonderful to see, I suppose, that younger generation taking ownership of, in a wonderful way of the music, and to see that link with that sense of community identity is particularly I think unique. So yeah, Sinna Bhuile Gum enough. I hope that's given you a little bit of a taste of the tradition in Dingle, and have I kept to my time? Yeah.
Wow, that was amazing, absolutely amazing. Thank you so much, Aoife. And the timing, just unreal. Best ever. So we're going to keep questions to the end, if that's okay, and then we'll go through all three speakers at the end. So now I'm going to invite Vincent Hyland up, and we're going to move from humanity in space to nature in space and enjoy a trip through the book that he has developed. Thanks, Vinny.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody, and particularly Maurice and the team for inviting me to speak to you here today. It's a pleasure to be talking about nature. It's something that I am so lucky to have been immersed in for most of my life, particularly since we came down here in the early 60s, and I think it was probably about 3.5 or 4 when I realised the beauty of Derrynane and the extended Iveragh Peninsula, and particularly for me, because I'm so much involved in underwater, the islands and offshore realms that I've explored and discovered both during the day and at night. And today I really wanted to just introduce you to the sounds of the area, sounds that I have recorded sometimes using a dustbin lid that people use for burning domestic rubbish. They're absolutely amazing as parabolic microphones. You can stick a microphone in the middle of them, hold them up, and you can record all sorts of bird sounds. And in fact, I have recorded in the past a beautiful 10-minute recording of the dawn chorus of the area using that same microphone and setup from Castle Cove all the way over to Waterville. And it's something that I can share with you later if anybody wants to listen to it. It really is an immersive sound piece. It's everything from the seabirds to our woodland birds and our field birds as well. I wanted to take you through some of the sounds, some of the stories in relation to gatherings. So some of these, we're all familiar, of course, with cuckoos and, you know, how they come and they leave. And some of the mysteries, for instance, of the cuckoos have been resolved of late because our NPWS colleagues in Killarney National Park satellite tracked some cuckoos this year. In fact, the one that I sponsored, one called Cuac Torque, was fluttering around the Torque area of Killarney earlier on in May this year. In fact, arrived, I think, around maybe the end of April and was actually satellite tagged on the 17th of May. And only 6 weeks later, it started its journey back south again. And it flew on a journey from here over to France, down over the Alps and into Bosnia-Herzegovina, so that by the end of June, it spent many, many weeks there. And it's remarkable to think that when we hear a cuckoo passing through the Ivera, you know, we really don't know. We have an idea that they come from Africa and they return there. But where exactly do they go is one mystery that's these scientists are helping to resolve. And this particular cuckoo crossed the Mediterranean down by northern Greece, probably around maybe the first or second week of June, and it ended up crossing the Sahara for 60 hours non-stop until it reached Sahel. And there it stayed for many weeks feeding, and then it eventually has ended up down in the Congo. So it was the first of the Irish cuckoos tracked to reach there. Now I'm going to play you some sounds of cuckoos. And in this case, this cuckoo that I recorded was actually after dropping Neil, our son, Mo is here in the front here, off to school. And it was one of those mornings where I dropped Neil to school, and, you know, to hear a cuckoo here, it's kind of like, oh my God, there's a cuckoo. I've got to drop everything. And that's exactly what I did. I dropped Neil off school, and I headed into the village. I had a quick listen. I said, where is it? Where is it? And it actually was somewhere in an area above John and Kay O'Connor's, God rest Kay, place, somewhere in there. So through bramble, getting cut, this and that, and I had a fantastic microphone, and eventually I got to where I thought the cuckoo was. Was it there? Not a chance. Was it over there? Absolutely not. Was it back there? I'm sure it came from here. And then to my surprise, I hear cuckoo, cuckoo. And where was it? I was at the base of a tree. It was directly up above me, looking down at me. So I got this recording. So here we go, a cuckoo. Beautiful male. Okay, so the next story involves the marine. I've had many, many times where I've gone underwater, and particularly off Derrynane, sometimes the Bull Rock, sometimes the Skellig, sometimes Scariff. And we're absolutely blessed to have some of the most amazing marine life that comes to visit our shores. Sorry about that, that is definitely not. Everything from dolphins, common dolphins, bottlenose dolphins, you know a lot about this, Eleanor. Species like whales, humpback whales. And in fact, we saw a humpback whale earlier on this year in February. In fact, when we sent the fluke shot, the tail shot of this humpback whale that we spotted off the Derrynane Hotel area, Glambeg, it was the earliest recorded whale ever to come to the country in Ireland. So that was a really great first. But I remember being offshore here, and I was off Derrynane Beach, just around the right-hand side of a little rock called Carrigy Crone. And it was nighttime, and I was filming swimming crabs mating. I was just lying on the sand, and it was really dark, but it was very calm. And I felt something in my head, and I felt uneasy. And I finished up what I was doing, came to the surface, and I headed back home. Not before I went up to say a quick hello to Bridie, of course, as was customary. And anyway, I put the tape in the drawer for a good few months, and I got an email from a French company saying, have you any footage of crabs mating? And I said, I do, actually. Could you send it to us, because they were looking for it for a program. So I got the tape out, I rolled it up, and I'm listening and watching, and because, you know, the camera underwater, it records the sound. And then I hear dolphins. And the dolphin sounds that I heard were probably from bottlenose dolphins, because we get them quite frequently here. And to my amazement, possibly when I was lying on the sand at night, these dolphins came up close to me. Because it was dark, I couldn't see them, but I felt something in my head, and perhaps maybe they were pinging me. And you get all of these type of experiences. So let me just play you common dolphin sounds. So we're going to do this. This is a group of about 80 common dolphins that passed by Two-Headed Island in 2012. And I put down some underwater microphones just to record these sounds. As you can hear, it's really, really noisy. So not only are you getting the sounds of them coming out of the water, the splashes of the waves going under the water, but you're getting this massive clicks and whistles. And to us, of course, it's inaudible, but to these microphones, you can pick them up. It's absolutely amazing. About 3 weeks ago, I was at the end of Lamb's Head with a lady from RTU doing a documentary, which is actually going out next Tuesday night at 10:30 in the evening. And we recorded the sound of shrimps, prawns, and they actually do this thing called snapping prawns. And what they do remarkably is they, as they, I'll just put this down here, as their prey goes past, snapping shrimp, they, on one of the claws, they close them really, really fast, and it sends out this tiny little bubble out towards the target prey. And the pressure of the surrounding water implodes the bubble. And you can actually hear the implosion. And when you listen to underwater, it's like frying eggs on a very, very hot pan. It's all this crackling stuff, you know. So I wanted to play you the next one here. This one is of a common dolphin, so bear with me. Bottlenose dolphins. So this again is recorded off the Ivory Coast. And there we go now. Again, quite noisy. Now, the background chatter, that's actually shrimp. So that's all those little implosions heading out. But the actual clicks and the cry, the whistles, they're all the common dolphins. And actually that, or bottlenose dolphins, that was at night, just towards nightfall. So they'd actually fed and they were just on the surface and they were just relaxing and chatting to each other. It actually reminded me of going to see the chimpanzees in Dublin Zoo. The next one I'd like you to bring to your attention really is myself and Mo were actually in the gardens here one April, and we heard this weird sound. Mo heard this weird sound. She said it's coming from over there, and we walked into the dense undergrowth towards the sound, and really hadn't got a clue what it was. I'm going to play it to you first, and then I'll explain exactly what it is. If anybody's heard this before, please let me know. Okay, so first of all, I thought it was a heron, okay, because herons nest here high up in the trees. But then, luckily for us, this white bird, flew overhead, heading into the nest. It was actually a little egret. That's the sound of the little egret. And that's the male coming back to the female, who's sitting on the eggs in the nest. And they just start doing this warbling and chatting away. And then the male, which we could see, just snapped its beak closed real quick, and that was that last snap. So that was remarkable. So I don't know. It's just I love the whole thing about sounds here. Here's an encounter with a pair of ravens, for instance. So when I was finishing off my book last year, I decided that I would go and record the natural nesting history of the pair of ravens that nest on Abbey Island, as an example. And when you get to know these birds, you get to know their calls, and you kind of can work out exactly what they mean. Kind of, but probably not exactly. And this was a pair. This was a raven, a female, who was high up in a tree, and the tree was covered in ivy, and it was coming into the end of October into November. So the ivy berries were actually ripening, and they were feeding on it. She was just there high up, and she was looking down at me, and she kept on feeding, and then eventually she started to call. And as the call changed, her partner, the male, flew over her and landed at the other side of the tree. And this is the sound that she was making. Now, as the male approached, she changes the sound. So it's possible. Is it possible that she was just chatting away and said, you know, I'm here, there's plenty of food, why don't you join me? And eventually, as he landed, she changed to that call. Now, for anybody that's walked Bolus or any of the headlands here around the beautiful peninsula that we have here in Yvra, you would often hear ravens, and you would often hear them actually utter a call of alarm. And most times that's what we hear. But if you just study and sit down with ravens, you'll hear an amazing array of vocalizations. So, like I say, it's just a different world really here. Going to give you then back here, just to kind of bring it back to the estate here, to the a bat called Lesser Horseshoe Bat. This is a real stronghold for them. Derrynane has probably somewhere in the region of about maybe 60 to 70 Lesser Horseshoe Bats. Now, during the winter, from now on, they all head into caves, souterrains, and they stay there for the winter, where the temperature is usually around 10 or 12 degrees centigrade, just enough to keep them alive. And then they re-emerge in the spring. And when they come out, they all come out together. All the males, all the females, all the young ones from last year. And then eventually, the males go their way. In fact, there's a roost of males in the stable houses here, and the females then roost up in another place. So they actually, they go there to make a nursery, because when their young are born, that's where they hang out, and they feed their young. It's amazing to see. So this is their sound. This was recorded about 3 years ago. Yeah. Now, I reckon they'd give the Wren a run for their money there, you know, for sure. Well, okay, I'm almost there. I'm just having a look really to see. Yeah, okay, gannets. We all love gannets. Now, I love puffins too, but I think gannets are my favourite bird. And one time when I was filming gannets and dolphins, common dolphins, I noticed that common dolphins were travelling around the area from, you know, sometimes I've seen this off the Blaskets, I've seen it off the Skelligs, I've seen it in the bay here in Kenmare Bay. And you'll find that gannets generally tend to say, well, hang on a second, I'm not going to look for food myself today. I'm going to find some common dolphins and I'm going to follow them. Because when they dive down, they bring the food up and I can have a really remarkable time feeding easily and not expend too much energy. So what I did was I found one of these groupings, gannets and dolphins working together, and I put hydrophone mics around just to record the sound of gannets hitting the water. Okay, and this is the sound here. So like a whoosh sound, you know, but it's remarkable because you see with dolphins, even if they're kilometres away, they'll actually hear that gannet activity. They'll hear that sound in the water, and that's what they'll move towards. Thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed that.
I think we can all agree that it is an absolute treasure to have someone like Vinny living in this area, recording the wildlife and nature like he does, and then making it accessible to people to have that experience. Like, wow. This morning has been fantastic. Our 3 speakers, just absolutely unbelievable. From culture to architecture to nature, like what a journey we've had. I hope you've all enjoyed it as much as I have. We do have a couple of minutes for questions. If anyone has any questions, and I'll ask the speakers to maybe come up here and then answer them up here so everyone can hear. Yeah, just if you want to pass the mic there, there's one just behind you in the...
Right, I'm just one moment, Miriam. Just to let the people in the AV room know that we'll be with them in just a few minutes if anyone would like to comment from there. There's a separate mic out there.
Can I just say really how there were really 3 superb lectures. First of all, I just want to thank Vinny. I don't think I'll ever walk along the sea in quite the same way again. Listening to these sounds, it'll linger with me for a long time. So I really want to thank him. I really mean that, you know, because we go for these walks and we're captivated by the beauty of the place and we hear these sounds. But as I said, I certainly won't be listening to them in the same way after today. It's fantastic. Victoria, I thought I knew something about Derrynane, but I realised how little I know about it. But I have a question for Victoria, and that is, you know, she has these etchings and so forth. To what extent do these reflect the reality or the actuality of what's portrayed? Are they romanticised? Are they factual or are they actual? That's my question to you. And then I have one other question for Aoife about the Renboy tradition. I remember 10 years ago when we launched the school, we had a lecture that was given by Mick O'Connell, the great footballer. And he talked a little bit about, obviously, about football in Valencia. And there was all sorts of questions about all sorts of things. And somebody stood up and said, he said, have you ever looked at the flag of Valencia? And well, it's this kind of yellow and red or whatever. And somebody said, no, it was actually the flag of Spain, you know, without the crown. And the point he was making was that there was such a close relationship between Valencia and Spain that was actually reflected in the flag of the local football team. So my question to you is, you referred to the fact that Dingle had these close relationships with Spain as well. I'm just wondering if any of the flags or emblems reflect that kind of... I know Declan, my friend, colleague Declan Downey knows a great deal about these relationships between Ireland and Spain, but I was just wondering if these flags or these emblems, if they reflect that tradition, or, you know, how is the kind of colour code, but how does it reflect something kind of historical? Or?
We might take question for Victoria first.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Maurice. Yeah, I think in relation to the drawings and etchings, obviously I don't know for certain. There are drawings that you can compare, so the likes of the Charterton one, the Cusack one, so I can compare those to maps and see that a lot of the detailing on the drawings accords what we see on the maps. So for those ones, I would say yes, they're probably quite good renditions, although probably maybe stylized a little with a little bit of personality of the artist. But I think the likes of the drawings from Fogarty, the one hanging in the hall here, is really a flight of fancy. And I would also argue that they were probably designed to try and bring in the elements very, very important to O'Connell, so that those sheer mountain slopes, that narrow little road leading up on the right-hand side of the image that's almost vertical, they couldn't have possibly have worked, you'd have fallen off. The very, very strong positioning of the abbey in the island, that's very, very prominent positioning. The peasants walking through the landscape with a little sack thing on his back, and of course O'Connell very, very dominant in the forefront, almost like a kind of that Gaelic chieftain effect. So I think in some of them, and there are quite a few online in the National Library website, which is absolutely brilliant, that we can sit at home and look at these and go, and you mentioned that yesterday. So I too am sitting at a kitchen table going, hey, wow, look at this. But so I think it really does depend, but it's fascinating to see some of the elements on the likes of Cusack ones or the Charterton one, the ladies, I'll add, which seem to be quite truly reflected on maps. So that's it, thank you.
Flags, not to my knowledge. Now, there might be others that would know of specific things, and even around the colours that are used. We'll say, what I was talking about, the Rand today, they're all sort of the green and gold as the Kerry thing adapted. But in terms of the connection with Spain, I think it's very evident in Dingle, and many of you probably, there was a Treaty of Dingle, we have the plaque of that, and the great local historian, the late Micheál O'Dúchlána, often spoke about, you know, back in the Blaskets, similar to Valencia, I suppose, the connection with Spain, that they say that back through the, I suppose, you know, 200 years ago more, that the first language was Irish, the second language was Spanish, you know, because they were dealing with people. But in terms of flags, I don't know of anything that's very obvious in terms of the influence, but...
We have a comment from the AV room. Thank you, Aoife, for your splendid presentation on Dingle and the Ran. I'm sure my friends in Dingle will be delighted to know you've been a perfect ambassador for the place this morning. Now, and also my congratulations to Victoria and the other speakers this morning. It was absolutely fascinating. So, Victoria and Vincent, well done. Regarding the flags and your question there, Maurice, we do know that when the Spanish arrived in Dingle in 1579 with James Fitzmaurice Fitzgerald, that they brought a number of colours with them, particularly the colours of Galicia, the blue and gold, and also, of course, of Castile itself and Aragon, which would be the red and white of Castile and the red and gold of Aragon. And that these were replicated in the standards of the various companies of the Geraldines in the Great Geraldine Rebellion of 1579 to 1583. Just to remind everyone that in a couple of days' time, the 11th of November, we'll be marking the 440th anniversary of the death of the last ruling Earl of Desmond, Gerald Fitzgerald. So these colours that I mentioned that were brought by the various the Spanish and the Italian troops that arrived with Fitzmaurice in 1579. And we know that from Freire de Andrade, he was one of the Spanish commanders who fanned out into Munster with various companies during that period of the Second Desmond Rebellion or Desmond War, that the Spanish colours were adapted along with the Desmond cross saltire. That's the red cross, an X cross on a white. So it was to distinguish the different companies, the militias, if you like, on the Desmond forces, and their Spanish and Italian allies, mainly Spanish, I might add, and that these colours probably continued through the ages to be used by various groups to create that sense of a connection with the past, because it is something that is picked up by Charles Smith in his work later on when he speaks about these connections, and Friar O'Sullivan as well in his great history of Kerry. And that and it is a point that Herbert and Fenton, the Elizabethan commanders at the time, they also comment on how these colours from Spain are being adapted by the Irish and their militias. So I hope that casts some sense of a historical connection there, and but certainly the tradition is very, very strong, particularly in the Dingle Peninsula. In fact, it was 1579 that we have a report from Recalde about the Blasket Islands, and the Blasket Islanders speaking Spanish. And as Aoife pointed out, even up to 200 years ago, it was the second language of the region. And, well, we could give another lecture about all of that, Morris. So I won't do that. I think there's a scent of coffee and more delicious pastries wafting across the courtyard here. So there we are.
Thank you so much for that comment. That was very informative. Does anyone have any other pressing questions? There's one here at the front. We might just take one or two more, and then it is tea time.
Thanks, Mary. Thank you. First of all, an absolutely incredible morning. I'll keep it very, very brief. One is just a quick comment. It's just when Victoria was speaking about how the O'Connell's house wasn't facing onto the peasant land, I think it's very much what Sigerson Clifford was getting at in a play that he has in O'Connell, The Great Pacificator. I mentioned it yesterday, so that's really, really interesting. Just a quick question for Aoife. The first photograph you showed, now my head is stuck in amateur drama in the heart of the community, the history I'm looking at. There's the first photograph, there's the Colleen Bawn. Mm-hmm. Am I imagining it, but would that have anything to do with kind of amateur drama tradition in Dingle? Because Busco's plays would have been very, very popular at that time.
I never thought about that actually in terms of amateur drama.
Don't mean to put you on the spot.
No, but it's really interesting. And funnily enough, and that was a kind of a rally, the Republican volunteers and all of that in the front. But that sort of idea, even in terms of the RAN and having what they used to call stunts, and dramatics in front of the RAN was a huge thing in the early 20s, for the first half of the 20th century. So sort of amateur dramatics, I suppose, in many ways. So they would have had those great stories around the Great White Hope, the boxer, is it? And they had a thing about Mrs. Simpson and in the Crown, Your Man the King, that had to be abdicated. And they had there's lots of wonderful stories around the drama that would happen in front of the RAN groups, and then the hobby and stuff would follow behind. So there was a tradition which has died out since, I'd say, the late 70s, but recent enough. So in terms of that photo in particular, I don't really know, but yeah.
Thank you, Aoife. Yeah. Thank you.
Question here, if we can.
Yep, go ahead.
Just a quick one for Vincent. I was just wondering, fascinating, but you've been in and around this area for some decades, and I was wondering whether you've noticed changes in behaviour or frequency of what's out there, and given all the pressures on nature and wildlife, we're here in an area which has got about as good as it can get, and I just wondered if you've noticed changes.
Predominantly in the context of what I would say biomass. So, extraction in the oceans, for instance, is having quite a bearing on the inshore population of different species. The taking of, for instance, wrasse from our local reefs for the salmon industry. I've seen major declines in wrasse populations around reefs, for instance, just submerged reefs up and down the bay. Whereas in the 70s, when I was diving first into the 80s, you would constantly see, a couple of 100 wrasse on one reef system. You're lucky to see maybe 10 now. So removal of species is one thing, and that's having a direct impact. The other thing is warming seas. So since they started recording in 1961, the yearly temperature, the average yearly temperature of the ocean surrounding us, this is the inshore maritime areas of Ireland, we've seen a 0.9 degree increase in my lifetime to now, and more and more frequently on my dives, I'm seeing much more warm water species. We have relatively intact woodlands here, of course, thankfully, and pockets of very, very vibrant and vital biodiverse spots where we're still seeing really good returns of black caps, of small little birds that come in, chiff-chaffs, all of those. So if you take just the chough population in the immediate area of the Iver Peninsula, it seems to be holding its own, and particularly in Derrynane, since I've been recording that, the average seems to be around the 40s for the numbers of choughs here. These are crows, red-billed chows. So just small little changes. It just depends, really. Thank you.
Thanks, Vincent. Are we okay now? I think we'll wrap up. So because tea is calling us. Yes, I'll pass over to Mary there, but I just want to thank the speakers again for such fantastic presentations. Yes, it's been a wonderful morning, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the weekend. And huge thanks, of course, to Mary and the whole committee that make this possible every year. Sure, we wouldn't be here without you.
Thank you, Eleanor, and thank you for chairing it so beautifully. Well, what a wonderful morning. I feel like a bit of a bookseller this weekend, but we have another gorgeous book which will ensure that you can be in Derrynane every day of your lives. And that's Wild Derrynane by Vincent Hyland. And it is a treasure, as you are, Vincent. And it's only €50. And Vincent has signed copies at the front, just on your way out. So it's something that you can treasure wherever you are and learn so much about the beautiful world that we live in. Now we break for coffee, and I've persuaded Mirish, took a little bit, that we'll get 30 minutes because we're running fairly on time. So if you all promise to be back in 30 minutes, there's the most delicious scones and coffee in Kerry ready for you, and they're going to be served in the cafe. So if you just give, I would say maybe, if you divide yourselves between the cafe and the marquee, and we'll see you back here in 30 minutes. Enjoy.
Now, good afternoon. It's almost afternoon now, so we're all ready to begin our session now. I'm Mary Lyne. I worked here as a guide for a number of summers, so I developed a great interest in Daniel O'Connell and have great memories of my work here before I retired. Our speakers for this session, we have as the first speaker Tom Dillon. He's a native of just outside Listowel, North Kerry. Tom works as a tutor in Causeway with the ETB and has taught and researched over the years on local history. Local history is very important, as we all know, because it's the cornerstone of our communities in Kerry. And Tom has done work on researching family history, place names of Listowel and surroundings, and folklore and local history. he was mentioned yesterday in the context of Owen O'Shea's work, because Owen was talking about the decade of centenaries. And Tom contributed to the work of Kerry County Council because he was contracted as a historian in residence in 2020. One of the main tasks which Owen mentioned was compiling a list of sources that are useful for people who are working online and far away from Kerry and who want to find out more about the difficulties and wars and troubles in Kerry. His talk today is on Prince of Attorneys, Pierce Mahoney, and his relationship with Daniel O'Connell. So I'm sure you're ready for a great talk, because he is still tutoring in Causeway on topics of interest, and he finds that his adult students have a tremendous interest in local history and in the background of families and people and places. So you're welcome, Tom. Thank you.
So thank you and good morning to everyone. It's an absolute honour to be here in Derrynane House this morning. Only a few weeks ago, I spoke up in a church in Wicklow, in Ballinure Church of Ireland, and it's a place associated with Pierce Mahoney. And it's amazing the way in the space of a few weeks, it's come full circle to come back around here to Derrynane and to the home of Daniel O'Connell and the church of Daniel O'Connell, where he was so much associated with. So, known as the Prince of Attorneys, Pierce Mahoney was one of the most eminent solicitors of his time in Ireland. He was a lifelong friend of Daniel O'Connell and his ally in many important political campaigns, in particular the quest to secure Catholic emancipation. A member of the Church of Ireland, Pierce used his influence to help rally the support of liberal Protestants in Ireland who added their voice to calls for relief for their fellow Christians. In Pierce's own words, the cause was a sacred one, and when it was secured in 1829, he considered it the fulfilment of his life's ambition. When his fellow Kerryman O'Connell went to the House of Commons in Westminster in 1829 to claim his seat as the honourable member for Clare, Pierce was by his side. They later fell out over the issue of repeal, but soon resumed their friendship, and in the decades that followed, they helped move Ireland into the modern age, promoting the establishment and expansion of the country's railway network, facilitating its growing prosperity in agriculture, tourism and trade. So yes, there we go. So Pierce Mahoney was born on December 19, 1792, it is believed, at Woodlawn in Killarney. His father was the agent of the Earl of Devon's estates in the neighbouring county of Limerick, while his mother, Maria Monsell, came from Ballybrood House, 12 miles southeast of Limerick City. She was a member of the Church of Ireland, and Pierce and his younger brother David were raised as Protestants. It is not known, however, if they were the first generation of their family to belong to that religious tradition. The history of the O'Mahony family maintains that their father was a Catholic, and through his first wife, left 4 half-siblings of Pierce and David who were all Catholic. And this is important to consider because it undoubtedly would have influenced their views when it came to Catholic emancipation. This is Woodlawn in Killarney, just near the Flesk Bridge. In 1812, Pierce and David added their signatures to a Protestant petition to Parliament calling for the relief of Roman Catholics. Both were listed as of Woodlawn at that time and remarkably were young in years. Pierce was but 19 years old and David a mere 17. It shows that from a young age they had an interest in civil liberties for all and religious toleration. Pierce was educated for a time at the Erasmus Smith School in Ennis and at the Academy in Killarney. His memorial for admission to the Honourable Society of King's Inns in Dublin, the oldest school of law in Ireland, reveals he was apprenticed to his uncle Charles Monsell, attorney of Great Ship Street, Dublin in 1809. By 1814, his law studies were completed and he became an attorney of the Court of Exchequer before taking his brother David, this is his brother, as an apprentice. The pair ran a hugely successful legal business at William Street and later at Dame Street in Dublin. They were solicitors to a number of banks as well as stock and insurance companies. So the firm of P&D Mahoney was a busy one. You couldn't help feel sorry for poor old David here, because the story was that he did all the work while Pierce did all the talking. It is maintained the brothers accrued such wealth that on one occasion they loaned Lord Hertford £100,000. So they were fairly well off. Pierce and David set themselves up as squires with residences in Dublin near their business, coupled with country estates in Wicklow and Kerry. In the 1830s, they purchased the Grange Con estate in County Wicklow and the Gun Cunningham estate in North Kerry, which contained over 6,000 acres and included what later became known as Kilmorna House. This is one of the few photos that exist of Kilmorna House. So a number of letters appear in Maurice O'Connell's volumes on the correspondence of Daniel O'Connell, which give an insight into the lifelong friendship between Pierce and King Dan himself. The earliest known meeting of the pair, interestingly, involved a court hearing in Tralee in 1821 and a challenge to a duel. Sounds like a good novel or a film. On that occasion, Pierce underwent a long direct cross-examination by Councillor O'Connell. Now, that wouldn't be the usual means of starting a lifelong friendship, would it? The case was brought by Pierce after he had been issued the challenge to a duel by a local army officer who had taken offence to information he admitted sharing from a third party. Despite O'Connell's questioning in the case, Pierce refused to deliver the name of the third party, with the result that it was agreed the case would go no further, each paying their own costs. So, in my opinion, Pierce won O'Connell's admiration for his determination not to land the third party in a position where they might be called out to uphold honour at 10 paces. Writing to his wife after the case, O'Connell wrote of honest Pierce Mahoney, the attorney. 6 years earlier, O'Connell himself had taken the life of the stair in a duel, and he was subsequently an avowed opponent to the practice. As a measure of their friendship in later years, Pierce's descendants had in their possession in 1901 the pistols which were claimed to have been used by O'Connell in the historic duel with the stair. From his correspondence, it is known that O'Connell valued Pierce's friendship in the greatest regard. Writing from Derrynane in 1828, he expressed his pride in their acquaintance and revealed the enormous influence Mahoney held on his mind. "My dear Mahoney," he wrote, "I would do at your request as much as I would do for any other person living. I know and I have already felt and most highly value your friendship. I am not only pleased with it, but proud of it." The pair were the staunchest of allies over many years, and for one brief period the bitterest of enemies. When they were on good terms, the Laird of Derrynane here lauded Pierce with grandiose esteem, calling him Don Magnifico. But when they fell out, he referred to his fellow Kerrymen as Pomposo and Don Proposo. You could hear the disdain. Both of them were employed in the legal profession, O'Connell as a barrister and Pierce as a solicitor. They would have known each other from law circles in Dublin, and indeed on one occasion O'Connell appeared in court on behalf of Pierce, who had purchased a pair of horses which subsequently went lame. The two Kerry natives were neighbours in Merrion Square, then a fashionable quarter in the Irish capital. Pierce lived on the north side of the square, while O'Connell's residence was on the southern side. Pierce was famed for his this is an image of O'Connell's home in Merrion Square. Pierce was famed for his hospitality, and many influential figures were invited to dinner at his house. It can only be presumed O'Connell was a regular guest. In England, the home of Lord Holland in Kensington, London, became a social centre for supporters of Whig politics at that time. And the Whigs were very much at that time advocating for the expansion of representation in Parliament and reform of Parliament, and that was to include emancipation for Catholics. And Pierce's home in Dublin was seen as its equivalent in the Irish capital, becoming known as the Irish Holland House. Pierce was a staunch advocate of the Whigs and financially supported the party in Ireland. So prominent was he as a quasi-political figure that supporters of their principles in Dublin came to be known as the Mahoney Whigs. It was remarked of Pierce's home that, quote, "they gathered round his generous board and discussed the hopes and fears of their party while they discussed the flavour of his wines. In August 1828, O'Connell appointed Pearse as his parliamentary agent and quickly declared him the best I ever knew. He knows all the members as well as all the ways of the House. He regularly attends the parliamentary sessions and has carried more difficult acts of Parliament than any other Irish or English solicitor ever did. The newspapers marvelled at O'Connell's choice of agent, in particular his readiness to place his confidence in someone from across the religious divide. Mahoney, one newspaper noted, is in religion a Protestant, but in the creed of the law Mr. O'Connell and he are equally devout and steady believers. By the early 19th century, many of the penal laws discriminating against Catholics had been relaxed. Full emancipation had been promised with the Act of Union, but was not fulfilled. And nearly 3 decades later, Catholics were still not able to take their seats in Parliament. There was nothing to stop them running for election. The problem came with the oaths they were required to swear before taking their seat in Westminster. No Catholic could take the oaths with a clear conscience, as they basically amounted to an individual renouncing their Catholic faith. Certain sections of the Protestant population, notably the Orange Order and the anti-Catholic Brunswick clubs, were vehemently against any measure of relief being granted to Roman Catholics, and they made their opposition clear. However, O'Connell's victory in the Clare by-election in July 1828 electrified the political landscape, and liberal Protestants who had previously remained silent or viewed the issue with apathy began to voice their support for Catholic relief. Most of the men of wealth, rank, influence and power in Irish society were Protestant, and Pearse Mahoney was at the forefront of rallying them in aid of the cause of emancipation. In November 1828, his name and that of his brother David, as well as the Duke of Leinster and 70 other Irish peers, 22 baronets and 52 MPs, were among the signatures of a Protestant declaration expressing their wish to see relief granted to His Majesty's Roman Catholic subjects. The declaration was transmitted around Ireland and collected over 2,000 signatures, with Pearse among the most active in obtaining the names. This record of exclusively Protestant support was duly forwarded to London to be laid before King George IV, the Duke of Wellington, Home Secretary Sir Robert Peel, and the Houses of Parliament. The declaration was followed by the founding of the Society of the Friends of Civil and Religious Liberties, of which Pearse Mahoney was appointed Secretary to the meeting. Similar to the Catholic Association, which added weight behind O'Connell's agitation, its membership was open to all religious denominations, and liberal Protestants subscribed in large numbers. The movement gained added momentum with the sudden recall of Lord Anglesey, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, who was pro-emancipation, and it was noted had opened the viceregal courts to liberal Protestants who had in former times been as unwelcome there as Catholics. On January 20th, 1829, a meeting was organised by Pearse Mahoney and John David Latouche of the Friends of Civil and Religious Freedom at the Rotunda in Dublin. With an estimated 4,000 to 5,000 people in the hall, contemporary sources state it was one of the most numerous assemblies of the nobility and gentry of Ireland which had ever convened in public meeting. An address was forthcoming, aligning the members with the feeling expressed in the earlier Protestant declaration, and petitions adopted which were to be forwarded to London. The Rotunda meeting demonstrated the support of liberal Protestants in unprecedented numbers to the cause of Catholic relief, and was noted as having an influential impact on public opinion and that of the government. Daniel O'Connell later praised Pearse for his patriotic exertions in organising this meeting, which in his words so eminently contributed to the success of the Catholic question. Only days later, the King's speech from the throne at the state opening of the new parliamentary session in Westminster surprisingly announced the government's intention to finally reach a resolution on the issue of Catholic emancipation. The Catholic Relief Bill secured majority votes in the House of Commons and the Lords before it received royal assent on the 13th of April 1829, the day of victory as O'Connell termed it. On the day it was given royal assent, Pearse Mahoney was in the House of Lords with O'Connell and a number of other Irishmen to witness the historic occasion and the realisation of a cause which Pearse viewed as sacred. Perhaps signifying the important part he played in rallying support for the measure, the Duke of Leinster approached Pearse at his seat and congratulated him. Pearse wrote to his brother David excitedly from the Lord's chamber. He wrote, and this is the letter. My dear brother, you may suppose I am very happy at this moment. My political pursuit has been successful. The royal assent was given to the bill for the relief of Roman Catholics of this great empire 5 minutes since. I heard it given. I thank God for this happy termination of this greatest of all questions, and I hope that the result will be what I have anticipated. My exertions in that sacred cause were sincere, and they have been acknowledged as useful is a subject of just pride to me. I shall now devote myself to my private pursuits and adieu to politics. Ever your attached brother, Pearse Mahoney. This letter was one of a number of documents which were donated in 2021 to Kerry County Museum by the descendants of the Mahoney family. A few other items as well included the Visitors' Book of Kilmorna House, which again opened up whole new discoveries about the history of the house that no one had ever known before. For example, among the signatures in the Visitors' Book were W.B. Yeats, who stayed in the house twice, and no one ever knew he came to North Kerry, let alone the county. So it's fantastic to have them in Kerry. And this letter, as I said, was one of them, and that all happened, thankfully, because I had done a lot of research on this since the time of COVID, but it was fantastic. It was during my term as historian in residence that the items were donated to the council, so it was lovely to be there at that time. The day after the Catholic Emancipation Bill had become into law, Pearse Mahoney organised a meeting in his apartments in London, and a committee formed with the object of raising money to erect a suitable memorial to the Duke of Wellington for his central role in securing emancipation. A subsequent public meeting held at the London Tavern was attended by Daniel O'Connell, who proposed a resolution of thanks to the noblemen and gentlemen who had signed the Protestant Declaration in support of the Catholic cause. Securing representation for Catholics in Parliament paved the way for other religions to claim their place in the Westminster legislature. Those agitating for Jewish emancipation at that time followed the successful campaign of 1829, and in his exertions to secure similar rights for Jews, Sir Moses Montefiore met O'Connell and Pearse Mahoney on 2 occasions at dinners and spoke to them on the subject. While the Emancipation Bill was making its way through Parliament, O'Connell decided to hold off on his plan to claim his seat in the House of Commons in case it might upset the bill's progress. Emancipation was granted, and a clause in the bill stated that new oaths would apply to Catholics returned after its commencement, which would not include the contentious refutations of faith in their previous format. However, as O'Connell was elected MP for Clare before the passing of the Act, he in theory was required to take the old oaths before taking his seat in the House. In an attempt to circumvent this obstacle, he approached Sir Edward Denny, with Pearse Mahoney acting as intermediary. O'Connell offered Denny £3,000 for the borough seat of Tralee for the remainder of the parliamentary session, but was met with a flat refusal. O'Connell was impatient to claim his seat, and Pearse worked with him to construct his case to be laid before the House of Commons, arguing he should not be obliged to take the former oaths. The top legal minds in England, along with the Crown lawyers, concurred with this opinion. However, parliamentary procedure was bound by the Act. During the Easter recess of Parliament, Pearse met with Sir Robert Peel and the Duke of Wellington on O'Connell's behalf, and it was ascertained that the government regretted O'Connell's position and would take no part against him, but would be guided by the eminent constitutional lawyers in the House of Commons. On Mahoney's return from this meeting, it was agreed that O'Connell would attend the House of Commons on Friday, May 15th. The House was full to the brim, and this is a painting of the old House of Commons. People often might think that it was the current House of Commons, which was only built in 1834, but this was the old House of Commons before the building was burned. The House was full to the brim, and the galleries packed with many peers of the realm when O'Connell entered the Commons chamber to take his seat. Having been called by the Speaker to come forward to take the oaths, O'Connell, in most theatrical pause, read the old oaths in silence, which had been presented to him by the Clerk of the House. After a few moments, he looked up and he told the House he refused to take them with politeness. It was recorded. The Speaker, whose role is to follow parliamentary procedure, asked him to withdraw. O'Connell left in silence, but returned the following Monday when Sir Robert Peel moved that he be allowed to speak from the bar of the House. By O'Connell's side was Pearse Mahoney, who had assisted him in preparing his case to be laid before the Commons MPs. The Liberator made a long and powerful argument, using merely a small slip of paper on which was written the heads of his address, and his books and references were handed back to him one by Pearse as his solicitor. His speech, said to be one of the most remarkable he ever delivered, did not move the verdict of the House, and his claim to take his seat under the new oaths was rejected. The Commons moved to have a writ for a new election to be held in Clare. O'Connell stood again, this time unopposed, and won his seat in Parliament. But it was not until a few years later that he finally took his place in the lower house at Westminster. He was by then beaten in the race to be the first Catholic to take their seat in the Commons by Sir Robert Throckmorton. Pearse Mahoney and O'Connell shared common ground in relation to the issue of Catholic emancipation. But on other issues, notably repeal, which was by then gathering momentum, they were at opposite ends of the spectrum. The two men fell out for a time over the issue, and when Pearse stood for election in Limerick in 1832, O'Connell launched a scathing attack on him in a letter which was published in the newspapers. Addressing the citizens of Limerick, O'Connell condemned Pearse, saying, "The betrayer is amongst you, the deceiver, the prince of political jobbers. I say nothing of him in his private life. I say nothing of him in his profession as an attorney. I assail him only in his public capacity as a candidate for the high honour of representing the unconquered city of Limerick. He deceived me for a time, but I only know him the more thoroughly on that account. I tell you from my heart and my conscience that you could not possibly select a worse man." No, and they were meant to be friends. Unsurprisingly, Pearse decided his bid for Parliament was hopeless, no surprise there, and he retired from the contest. But seemingly the pair shook hands that very day in Limerick, so that seems to have been how they came back together again. And later that year, his acquaintance with O'Connell had been fully mended, with the latter declaring, "There is no gentleman of his profession to whom I would be more willing to trust my affairs." O'Connell converted Pearse to his viewpoint on the issue of repeal, and in 1837 Pearse stood as a pro-repeal candidate for the borough of Kinsale, where his wife Jane Kennefick's family hailed from. With O'Connell's support, Mahoney won the election by a narrow margin of 5 votes, ousting the sitting MP Colonel Henry Thomas. Several months later, the result of the election was overturned when the Colonel petitioned Parliament claiming bribery and the manipulation of voters' lists. So that would kind of spell the end of Pearse's political career. Outside of his political activities, Pearse was the solicitor for the company which built the very first railway in Ireland, which opened in 1834 and ran for 10 kilometres from Dublin to Kingstown, now Dunleary. He embraced this modern mode of transport, and after enjoying a ride in a carriage driven by a steam locomotive with great pleasure, he noted, he extolled the invention as a triumph of science. Using his influence to promote the pioneering infrastructural link, Pearse lobbied against the many voices opposing its construction and the wider expansion of the railway network. Now, while this maiden line was being constructed, it became obvious that the length of the railway was insufficient, so a bill for its extension was presented to Parliament in 1834. A select committee, chaired by his good friend Daniel O'Connell, was appointed to consider the bill, which met opposition from various quarters. So these included Thomas Gresham, the hotel owner, who feared that the centre of economic trade might relocate from Dublin to a new Brighton out in Kingstown. A good bit on from that now, did that come to pass? As well as Jarvis, who would be done out of business, and supporters of a rival project in the form of a ship canal between the two destinations. O'Connell was initially sceptical of the project and suspected great injury could be caused to the country at large through dishonest speculation. It took a visit from Pearse Mahoney as the railway company's solicitor to convince him otherwise, and with his concerns allayed, the amended bill was favourably considered by Parliament. Pearse later became solicitor to a number of other railway projects. Along with Daniel O'Connell and other Kerry landowners, such as Maurice Fitzgerald, the Knight of Kerry, he was an active promoter of an ambitious project which sought to establish Valentia Harbour as the terminus of a transatlantic steam packet service connecting Ireland, Britain and Europe to the North American continent. Soon after the Dublin to Kingstown Railway was constructed and the line deemed a success, a meeting was held in Pearse's chambers in Trafalgar Square in London of several parties interested in promoting the transatlantic service, which would be connected to the Irish capital by a rail line. The plans envisaged a rail link running from the South Kerry Harbour through the provinces of Munster and Leinster to Kingstown Harbour, where they would connect with the cross-channel steamers to Wales and from there by railway to London, all in an estimated journey time of 50 hours travel. From the main arterial route, branch lines could then link with the ports of Limerick and Cork, along with the numerous market towns along the way. The plan, giving evidence to the Select Committee on Public Works in 1835, Pearse promoted Valentia as the perfect location for a state-funded refuge harbour for ships, suitable for all wind conditions. Valentia was well suited for such a purpose, being a deep harbour with numerous entrances and suitable for all wind conditions, which Pearse argued would help mitigate the loss of shipping which frequently beset traffic in the English Channel, as well as affording many advantages in times of war. The South Kerry port, it was planned, would become a gateway for transatlantic travel and promote the interests of Ireland and the British Empire, connecting up with Canada, the United States, West Indies, Spain, Portugal and the Mediterranean. In the end, the plan never attracted enough financial support. Pearse's public spirit became widely known, and as well as advancing the expansion of the railway network, he became a leading advocate of improved agriculture. From 1815, he was a member of the Royal Dublin Society, while he was also one of the founder members of the first Agricultural Society in Kerry in 1840. Pearse was an extensive breeder of Shorthorn and Kerry cattle, for which he won many prizes. His farm at Kilmorna was held up as a model farm, setting an example in husbandry and methods for others to emulate. The agricultural improvements on his property in North Kerry at Gunsborough, which was where the future Field Marshal Lord Kitchener was born in 1850, that was also part of the Mahoney estate, and Pearse leased Gunsborough to Kitchener's father. So Pearse's in the years before that, Pearse was praised for the employment he gave to the local poor in that area at risk of destitution. During the Great Famine, Pearse subscribed to the various funds set up for the relief of the poor in the North Kerry district and was the chief promoter of an ambitious project to carry out an extensive river drainage scheme in the area as a means of providing paid employment for the poor and improving the whole district. Unfortunately, the scheme did not come to fruition through a lack of support from the British government. Pearse became a member of the Royal Irish Academy in 1835. His legal career continued apace into the 1840s, when he defended O'Connell in the sedition trial. Although O'Connell was imprisoned, he was later released on appeal. Following the death of the Liberator in 1847, Pearse dealt tactfully with his will, and it has been commented that it was his able handling that may well have saved this place here in Derrynane, the O'Connell family home. O'Connell's burial in Glasnevin Cemetery surprised Pearse, who was on one occasion shown a tomb by the Liberator in Westland Row Catholic Church, which he had prepared as his final resting place, to which Pearse expressed his thoughts that Kerry would be the most fitting place for his remains to be laid. At the time of his own death in 1853, Pearse was serving as Clerk of the Crown in the Court of Queen's Bench. The newspapers announced his passing before he actually died at his then home at number 2 Kildare Street. He was buried in the family, I don't know what that happened today now, when people announce you were dead before you were. He was buried in the family vault, and this is his tomb in Mount Jerome Cemetery in Dublin. Pearse is commemorated with a stained glass window in Ballinure Church of Ireland near his family estate at Grangeconn, County Wicklow. And there's also a bust of the illustrious solicitor also to be seen at the St. Stephen's Green Club, of which he was a founder member with Daniel O'Connell. So writing after his death, the Freeman's Journal noted, "We believe no man of his age, with the exception of O'Connell, whose friendship he enjoyed to the last through all the warfare of parties and politicians, understood so clearly the social wants of Ireland. We could not fail to see in all his career evidence of as earnest and as enthusiastic a desire to advance his country, elevate her people and restore her prosperity. With his lifelong friend and fellow Kerryman Daniel O'Connell, Pearse Mahoney helped secure one of the greatest victories for democracy in modern history, paving the way for the representation of all religions in Parliament. Together, O'Connell and O'Mahony overcame bias, bigotry, disillusion and apathy in the cause of securing Catholic emancipation. Pearse helped to gather the support of liberal Protestants in numbers never before committed to that end, and by a number of demonstrations rallied that combined voice to help shape public opinion and many minds of influence in government. Politics for a time divided Mahoney and O'Connell, but they were united in the common goal of Ireland's prosperity. Pearse shared the values of O'Connell when it came to a rejection of violence, and was dedicated to achieving liberties by peaceful means. Aside from their influence in the political sphere, the pair helped bring Ireland into the modern age and were pioneers in the promotion of steam as a means of travel. O'Connell went down in history as a liberator who won religious freedom for millions of Catholics, but his Protestant ally Pearse has been largely forgotten, along with the part played in the whole struggle for that victory by their Protestant brethren. The lifelong friendship of these two figures of Irish history, Mahoney and O'Connell, represent an alliance of individuals who were able to come together regardless of a religious divide to achieve great things for their country and set an example of cooperation for the wider world to follow. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom, for a most interesting talk. It shows how two great minds, not just minds and thinkers, but activists, they were really great activists together, working together for the benefit of not only Kerry with the railway line, trying to get the railway down here, but also the work for emancipation, and they became international figures. We hadn't thought of Pearse Mahoney, and your talk has given us great elucidation on his importance in the life, and not just in terms of politics, but all the other activities he had under his wing, the legal work, the railway line, farming, and all of those other things. So thank you very much for a most interesting talk. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions afterwards. I'd like now to introduce you to our next speaker. And our next speaker is Dr. Beatrice Doran. Beatrice is an Irish historian, author, and former library director at various universities, including UCC, the RDS, and the Royal College of Surgeons. She was very far-seeing and innovative in helping to integrate library computer systems at an early stage in the development of technology. She worked internationally as a librarian consultant and has worked in various countries: Iraq, Sudan, Malaysia, the UK, Saudi Arabia. She has published 3 books, 2 on Donnybrook, and the third one on People of Dublin 4. So her topic tonight, or this afternoon, is Daniel O'Connell's successor as Lord Mayor of Dublin, Alderman George Rowe. He was Lord Mayor from 1842 to 1843. I hope you're welcome now, Dr. Beatrice.
Thank you very much, Chairman, for that very nice introduction. And I was absolutely fascinated, and I think we've a lot to talk about afterwards, because they were, Mahoney and George Rowe were contemporaries. I'd like in particular to thank Professor Maurice Brick, whom I've known since he was a student in UCC, and the members of the organising committee for inviting me to speak here about Alderman George Rowe, who I've been doing research on for a while. He succeeded Daniel O'Connell as Lord Mayor of Dublin. I'm going to begin with an obituary from the Freeman's Journal of the 21st of July, 1863, regarding the death of George Roe, who is described as a high-minded and honourable citizen, a warm-hearted and generous friend, a courteous and polished gentleman, and a sterling and uncompromising advocate of civil and religious liberty. Roe was the soul of honour, and there never was a more earnest assessor of truth and justice. The private virtues of George Roe were more clearly known by the poor and the needy, to whom he was a generous friend and benefactor. George Roe was born in Booterstown in 1796, the son of Peter Roe, a distiller, and his wife, Margaret Pigeon. The Roe family came originally from County Wexford, where they were distillers. Peter Roe, George's father, owned a distillery in Thomas Street from 1757. George inherited that distillery and amalgamated with another one, and that happened in 1832, and he formed the family distillery George Roe and Co., which was located at 157 to 159 Thomas Street. Roe's distillery was powered by a 150-tall smock windmill, which is one of the oldest in Europe. It's still in existence today, and it's known as St. Patrick's Tower. At one stage during the 19th century, George Roe and Co. was the largest producer of whisky in Europe. Guinness's, now known as Diageo, decided to produce a new brand of whisky, and they've called their new whisky Roe and Co. after the Roe family. This is a slide of the new distillery on the left, with a bottle of the new whisky, which is called Roe and Co. They have used the former Guinness powerhouse in Thomas Street as the home of their new distillery. George Roe was a member of the Church of Ireland, and he and his wife Mary married at St. Peter's Church of Ireland in Ainger Street in 1817. The church closed in 1950 and was demolished in 1983, and a YMCA hostel is now located where it was. George and Mary had no recorded children, and it was his brother Henry and Henry's two sons, also called George and Henry, who inherited George's distillery. So you can just imagine the confusion that has caused over the years. George Roe was extremely wealthy and had a reputation of being not only a good employer, but also was very generous to various charities, both Protestant and Catholic. This generosity extended to the next generation, when his nephew Henry sponsored the restoration of Christ Church Cathedral in Dublin to the tune of £220,000, the equivalent of about 25 million in today's money. The vast area of Roe's distillery was developed in the 20th century for municipal housing, and the portion adjoining Thomas Street was acquired by Guinness's. George Roe then was a wealthy distiller and an active member of the Dublin Chamber of Commerce. He also became Chief Magistrate, and his career as an alderman of Dublin City Council began with St. James's Ward, which he represented between 1841 and 1844, and again from 1852 to 1863. He was also a member of a number of other national committees, which would take me ages if I were to tell you about them. Dublin Corporation has been in existence since 1100 from the reign of Henry II of England. And after successfully campaigning for Catholic emancipation, Daniel O'Connell campaigned for the reform of Ireland's municipal corporations. As a result, they were totally restructured in 1840, and the Municipal Corporation Act of Ireland was the elected body when Dublin Corporation was reduced from 2 chambers to 1 chamber. The importance of the Municipal Corporation Act of 1840 cannot be overemphasised. Power up to then had been in the hands of the trade guilds and thus in Protestant hands. With the new Act Catholics became eligible to become members of Dublin Corporation. In 1841 to 1842, Daniel O'Connell became Lord Mayor of Dublin, and he was the first Catholic holder of the office since 1688. The importance then of the reformed Dublin Corporation cannot be overemphasised. The Protestant ascendancy of Dublin Corporation, which included George Roe, did not support the Municipal Corporation Act of 1840 because Protestants were afraid that the corporation would become exclusively papist and would introduce a new class of papist ascendancy. The great majority of Irish Protestants also failed to support Daniel O'Connell's repeal movement in the 1840s. George Roe was a friend of Daniel O'Connell, and even though a Protestant and a Unionist, he had supported the drive for Catholic emancipation. And he also supported Catholic charities, as I mentioned already. It was George Roe and John Arabin, two Protestant liberals, who proposed Daniel O'Connell, a Catholic, as Lord Mayor of Dublin. Later, these men also became Lord Mayors. The first meeting of the Reformed Corporation took place at the City Assembly House in South William Street, and it wasn't until 1852 that meetings of Dublin Corporation moved to the City Hall. What became known as the Mayoral Compact was instigated by Daniel O'Connell, who insisted that a Protestant should succeed him, and this alternated for some 40 years. This is the Mansion House in Dawson Street, and Lord Mayors have lived there for many years. When Daniel O'Connell was out of the country in England as a Member of Parliament, George Roe acted as Lord Mayor locum tenens for him. When Roe succeeded O'Connell as Lord Mayor in 1842, the Mansion House was under repair, and George Roe, as you can see from the bottom there, continued to live at his residence in Nutley, which is in Donnybrook. You can also see from the one above, July the 21st, 1840, on Saturday, Mr. O'Connell was entertained at dinner by George Roe, Esquire, at his seat, Nutley, near Stillorgan. Here's an image of the crest of Daniel O'Connell in the round room in the Mansion House, and also that of George Roe. Here's an image of the beautiful stagecoach that they would have travelled in to the Assembly House, the Academy House in South William Street, for their inauguration. O'Connell's term as Lord Mayor of Dublin was the first step towards modernising municipal governments. From 1829 until his death in 1847, he became a full-time politician and parliamentarian. Unfortunately, he failed to achieve his main goal, which was repeal of the Act of Union of 1800. In August 1841, O'Connell announced that he would not accept a second term as Lord Mayor of Dublin, as he wished to focus on his campaign for repeal of the Act of Union. About the same time, it was decided to change the date of the introduction of a new Lord Mayor from December to the following January, and Alderman George Roe therefore succeeded O'Connell in November 1842. Dublin Castle was the home of a lavish and glittering viceregal court. The image on the left is of gentry arriving at Dublin Castle for one of their many social evenings, and it's by Rose Barton. Each year there were several major court ceremonies and events, and every year the Lord Mayor held a banquet at the Mansion House for the Lord Lieutenant, which enabled him to meet the Dublin establishment. I was interested to hear about Mahony's involvement with the railways, because George Roe was the chairman of the Dublin to Kingstown Railway Company. And the railway went from Westland Row to Kingstown Harbour. William Dorgan, who lived between 1799 and 1867, had acquired the contract for this railway in 1833, and the line was completed in approximately 18 months. Westland Row, and I have the same image that you had, on the edge of the city, was chosen as the terminus. And this image apparently is by an artist called John Harris. Now, the only John Harris I could find on the internet was English and was born about 1948, so I must follow that up. This railway was the only one for several years in Ireland. It was the first passenger railway and was noticeable as the earliest dedicated commuter railway in the world. This was a time in Ireland when there was a growing interest in moving to the suburbs, to the new suburbs by the sea, such as Blackrock, Monkstown and Kingstown, so it was extremely popular. Let me tell you a little bit about the Great Industrial Exhibition of 1853, which took place 150 years ago, and of which George Roe was chairman of the organising committee. The exhibition was held in Dublin, in the grounds of Leinster House, at that time the home of the Royal Dublin Society. This year, the Royal Dublin Society is celebrating 150 years since the exhibition by holding a commemorative exhibition in the library of the RDS in Ballsbridge. And the National Gallery are also holding a seminar too about it. The exhibition was financed by William Dargan, who was a very wealthy man and who contributed £100,000 to the exhibition committee towards the cost. Unfortunately, when the bills were paid, Dargan ended up with a loss of £20,000. It was Dargan who asked the RDS to appoint George Roe, an active member of the RDS since 1829, as chairman of the exhibition committee. The aim of the exhibition was to draw attention to the Industrial Revolution taking place in the United Kingdom and in other parts of Europe, and to showcase in particular Irish arts and industries. The builder of the exhibition buildings was Richard Turner, a famous Irish iron founder and manufacturer of glass houses. Here is another view of the exhibition buildings, which was quite substantial. It was the largest international exhibition ever to be held in Ireland, and it lasted for 6 months from May to October of 1853. This slide on the left shows one of the main halls of the exhibition, and on the right are some of the gentry at the opening of the exhibition. The opening took place on the 12th of May 1853, and the opening address was read by the chairman of the exhibition, Alderman George Roe, in the presence of the Lord Lieutenant, the Earl St. Germans. The audience at the opening included 15,000 people of high rank in society, and the general public were only admitted the following day. Her Majesty Queen Victoria, accompanied by Prince Albert and 2 of their children, attended the exhibition, and they arrived in Kingstown, or Dunleary as we know it today, by boat. The welcome party to greet them included the chairman of the exhibition committee, Alderman Roe, and William Dargan. Dargan was included because of his generosity to the exhibition and the fact that the royal party travelled by train from Kingstown to Westland Row in a special coach built by the Dublin to Kingstown Railway Company. The Queen remained on in Dublin for 4 days and visited the exhibition each day, as well as accepting an invitation from William Dargan to visit him at his home at Mount Anvil Park, which is now Mount Anvil School. And she also visited George Roe at his home at Nutley. The Great Industrial Exhibition was the first exhibition to include art and paintings by Irish artists, and this is a slide of this section of the exhibition. The outcome of this exhibition saw work commence on the establishment of a National Gallery in Dublin. And the success of the Great Exhibition led eventually to its establishment, and the first wing is named the Dargan Wing after William Dargan, whose statue stands at the entrance to the gallery on Merrion Row. George Roe had at least 2 residences, one in Fitzwilliam Place and another in Donnybrook. So I want to talk briefly about Nutley, his home in Donnybrook. We know that Roe gave his address as Nutley when he joined the Royal Dublin Society in 1829, so we can presume that he was living there then. In Roe's time, the main entrance was on the Stillorgan Road, and this entrance continued until an owner of Nutley in the 1930s sold off the land and not part of the land, and Nutley Park and the houses on the Stillorgan Road are built on this grounds, which was formerly part of the Nutley estate. In Roe's time, there was a gate lodge at the entrance, which has been described as a model for buildings of a similar kind and very much in keeping with the character of the mansion to which it is an adjunct. And this slide is of images of what the gate lodge might have looked like. Later, the main entrance to Nutley changed to what is now Nutley Lane. You can see from this slide that Nutley is a Georgian house, and it is believed that the architects were Richard Morrison and his son William Vitruvius Morrison. It was at Nutley that George Rowe and his wife Mary entertained many distinguished international and local guests, whose visits were recorded in the daily newspapers of the time. George Rowe entertained Daniel O'Connell there and other important dignitaries from time to time. This is a report which was in the Freeman's Journal, headed Vice-Regal Court. Their Excellencies the Lord Lieutenant and the Countess St. Germain spent 3 hours on Monday at Nutley, the seat of our fellow citizen George Rowe, Esquire, inspecting his garden and farm operations, with which they were much pleased. Their Excellencies afterwards took part of refreshment and returned to the Vice-Regal Lodge at 5 p.m. Here's another one, reception at Nutley. Yesterday, His Excellency the Lord Lieutenant honoured Alderman and Mrs. Rowe with their presence as a guest at a reception at their picturesquely situated and tasteful villa, Nutley, to which numerous and distinguished party were invited for the occasion. Anyhow, it goes on a bit like that. So, George Rowe, besides being a very wealthy businessman, was also a keen farmer, like your friend. And we actually have in the left of this image a plan of the farmyard and offices of George Rowe, as George Rowe the farmer at Nutley, County Dublin. And the interesting thing is that they were designed by the city architect, J.J. Byrne. And a few years ago, Nutley is now the home of Ellen Park Golf and Sports Club. And this image here on the right is of part of his farmyard, which the golf club restored a few years ago. And the gardens at Nutley were designed by Ninian Niven, who was director of the Botanic Gardens between 1834 to 1838. And these are a few images of it. Beautiful balustrade, fabulous. I've come across a number of articles from 19th century journals where they describe Nutley in great detail, and this fountain is absolutely beautiful. And I was there one evening recently myself, and I took this rather nice one of the gardens at Nutley, and you can see the statues all around. And these are just a few shots to show you what it's like today. That is now putting green, and it's the first hole at the golf club. Finally, during his relatively short life, he was only 63 when he died. I just don't know how George Rowe managed to do so much and be involved in so many different things when he was not involved with Dublin Corporation and its numerous committees. George Rowe suffered from ill health in the 1860s and retired from his distillery. He and his wife Mary, on the advice of his doctor, moved to the milder climates of Torquay and Dublin, or in Torquay in the south of England, in Devon, and he died there on the 20th of July, 1863. His body was returned to Dublin for burial in Mount Jerome Cemetery. His funeral in Dublin was one of the largest ever seen since the funeral of Daniel O'Connell. 200 employees from Rowe & Co. distillery walked in front of the funeral from Nutley, all wearing white scarves and headbands. The burial took place in Mount Jerome Cemetery, so he's in the company of his friend. And with another member of Ellen Park History and Archives Committee, who's here with me today, we visited the cemetery to see if we could find the Rowe grave. We eventually found it, looking like this. And I managed to persuade Diageo to restore the grave, and this is how it looks like today. This is a close-up of the grave inscriptions, where you see, in memory of George Rowe, July the 20th, and quotation from the Bible, and in memory of Mary Rowe. She survived him actually for quite a number of years. He died in 1863, and she died in 1877. And I came across a reference to a Mary Rowe who had died in the London tomb, the London Mail, you know, the train in part of Wales at Abergall, and there was a Mary Rowe with an address at Nutley. So I presume she was because they had no children themselves, so I presume she was a niece of his brothers, or not his brothers, his uncle. But anyhow, Alderman George Rowe, former Lord Mayor of Dublin, distillery owner of Nutley Domain, and friend to the rich and poor, occupied a distinguished place in the history of Dublin, and of Dublin Corporation in particular, and he should not be forgotten. Just on that note, I met Dermot Lacey very recently, who's the Labour member of Dublin Corporation, and I said to him, "Did you ever hear of George Rowe?" "I did, of course," he said, "succeeded Daniel O'Connell as Lord Mayor of Dublin." I said, "Do you know he lived in Donnybrook?" "Lived in Donnybrook?" He said, "I never heard that." So anyhow, I have a date next week with him to show him Nutley. So anyhow, one of the many tributes after his death stated, "He was held in the highest esteem for his integrity and demeanour as a gentleman and a citizen, by men of all parties and creeds, and it is scarcely necessary to add that his death will be lamented by a large circle of friends as well as by the public." I leave you with this picture. Oh, that's, by the way, if you're ever in Mount Jerome Cemetery going to a crematorium, as you walk up the main avenue, you can see the beacon of light, the white on the left, and that is George Rowe's tomb. So, but I just leave you with, oh, that's another one of George Rowe. I just leave you with a picture of Daniel O'Connell, which is one with which I'm very familiar. It had belonged to my grandmother, who was a fan, and is now hangs in the hall of my house in Donnybrook. So thank you all for your attention, and my thanks again to Professor Murish-Brick, to Mary O'Connor and the organising committee for inviting me to speak here today, and I hope you all enjoyed the presentation.
Very much indeed for a lovely tour around the places we're all familiar with in Dublin. Gresham and Nutley Lane and all of those places. And we can see in both talks the companionship and friendship between the two men. In the case of Pearse Mahoney and Daniel O'Connell, and the case of George Rowe and Daniel O'Connell. So he unites all of these, and he's placed both in Kerry and also in Dublin. So a lot to think about. Thank you very much, Beatrice, for a most interesting talk, and it will prompt us to go and see the statue of him in Mount Jerome. Now we have time for some questions, so now is your chance to ask from Tom or from Beatrice any questions from either the AV room or the here. Okay, we have one here, Mary. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you to both speakers for some really interesting talks. Thank you. Just in relation to George Rowe and maybe family connections, I think Samuel Beckett's mother was a Rowe. I think Mary Rowe, I think, and I'm just wondering, therefore, if you know whether there was any connection. I know it's a bit later in time between those families. And just briefly then, secondly, at the time, say, O'Connell and George Rowe were Lord Mayor, in terms of political power, did the mayor at that point, you know, was it the seat of real political power, or was it more a ceremonial role at that time? Thank you.
I was not aware of the Rowe connection, but I'll certainly follow it up. What else did you ask me? Oh yes, the Lord Mayor. Again, I'm not an expert on Daniel O'Connell or on Dublin Corporation, but there's a wonderful book that's been written very recently about Dublin Corporation by James H. Murphy. And anyone who's interested in the history of Dublin Corporation, I'd strongly recommend it. It's really a good book. Okay.
Is there anyone in the AV room who would like to ask a question?
Any questions? Comments? No questions from here or comments.
Any other questions from either speakers?
Mary, I might just ask, maybe to ask Beatrice, what happened to the Roe Distillery? So we can't hear about the microphone.
It amalgamated with a number of other 19th century distilleries in Dublin.
Thank you.
Okay, sorry. I worked in Guinness for most of my lifetime, and I hate to tell you this, bring it down to, I parked my car under that windmill. But I just, in the photograph of the windmill, it shows what is a pear tree. And the pear tree is very old. It's, when I was there, and I'm a good bit out of it now, it was said to be over 150 years old. So, and it's still producing pears. They're full of worms, though I wouldn't eat one.
So any other questions? One more here in the chapel.
Just asking if Tom could link up Pierce Mahoney with Sir Arthur Vickers and the demise of Kilmorna House. Could you say a few words, Tom, on that, please? Thank you.
Yeah, just to link up Pierce and Sir Arthur Vickers would be a whole other lecture in itself. But I can say that what I can add is that Pierce Mahoney, his son, was Pierce Kennefic Mahoney, and he was married to a woman called Jane Gunn Cunningham. And Pierce Kennefic died actually in 1850 from, I think he got a kick from a horse. And he died, and his children, he was just after, his wife was just after giving birth to one of their two sons, Pierce Mahoney, who went on to become the chieftain Dio Mahoney. And he was a close friend of Charles Stewart Parnell. He's the man that kept the visitors' book at Kilmorna House and welcomed all the famous guests like W.B. Yeats and Parnell to Kilmorna. But their mother married again. Jane Gunn Cunningham married Colonel William Henry Vickers, and that's how Sir Arthur Vickers was related to the Mahoneys then. And of course, when Vickers was involved in the loss of he was blamed for the loss of the crown jewels in Dublin Castle, and he got the blame for it, and he lost his position as Ulster King of Arms, which was a hugely important position in the Viceregal Court in Dublin Castle. And he would have arranged a lot of the state events and the visits to Dublin by the Queen. I think when Queen Victoria died, when she died, he basically enacted what we would have seen on our TV screens last year when the Queen died and Prince Charles was proclaimed the new king. Well, he did that in Dublin on the passing of Queen Victoria. And when he lost his position as Ulster King of Arms, he came to Kilmorna, and he lived in the house with the permission of his sister, who the house was owned. She owned the house. And he was eventually killed there then in 1921, shot by the local IRA, and the house was burned and Kilmorna House was destroyed. The visitors' book survived because 20 years before that, Pierce the chieftain had inherited the Grange Con estate in Wicklow, and he took the visitors' book with him up there, so that's how that survived. The crown jewels then, there's a very interesting story out in Kilmorna when we went out there, that locals tell the story that Vickers buried the crown jewels out in Kilmorna. The crown jewels, if you don't know, is the biggest unsolved crime in Irish history still. They've still not been found. But locals in Kilmorna reckon they're buried out there anyway. And the ruins of the house were there for years after. And the farmer got fed up of all these people coming to the house, wandering in around it. So he, looking for the crown jewels, so he decided to bulldoze the ruins. And he took the rubble then down to the bank of the river. That's what the farmer told myself and another historian, Maurice O'Keefe, when we visited there a few years ago. And it's amazing, there's nothing left on the site of Kilmorna House. It's all a green field, and there's one tree growing there, a copper beech tree, which was planted by Charles Stewart Parnell. It's still there. And there was a second tree then that he planted on another visit, and that was dug up, and it was planted in Grange Con in Wicklow, where it's still growing. On our trip there a few weeks ago, we went up and we saw the tree. And there were branches cut from that tree then, and wreaths made from them, and they were placed on the Parnell Monument in Dublin in the 1950s. So it's a huge, it's amazing to see that it still grows there. But just to finish about the crown jewels, was that the farmer told us that the local people out in Kilmorna had great crack, that they'd go out and they'd bury rusty bits of bed knobs and door hinges under the ground. And then the speculators for the crown jewels would land with their metal detectors, and they thought they'd hit the jackpot, yeah. And the locals had a great laugh out of it, so yeah. That's it, thank you.
I think we'll finish off now. Any more questions? Just one final one, if there is anyone anywhere.
Okay.
Yes, we've one question from here.
One question more. Okay, thanks.
I've just got a question about, I know it's a bit of a long question, but are there links between Mahoney and O'Connell and the anti-slavery movement? And also, were women very involved in the movement for Catholic emancipation? Because I know in England they were very involved in the anti-slavery movement. Thank you.
I have to give you a very short answer to that question now, is that I'm no expert on Catholic emancipation, and I can't say how involved women were involved in advocating for that. But your first part of the question, were Mahoney and O'Connell related? They were related, and it was distantly, and it would have gone way back in their ancestry. As far as I know, one of the Mahoneys married one of the a woman of the Mahoneys married one of the O'Connells. So that's my understanding of it. It goes back a good few centuries, and it's amazing that they would have kept track of that, like they would still been aware of it, you know. So yeah, even in the 1800s, even in the 1800s. So I'm sorry I can't give a fuller answer, but you know, it definitely, what struck me researching the piece was, you know, really it's a kind of a neglected subject really for something that's so important, like, you know, because you know, the part Pierce Mahoney played and all the Protestants. I've looked at the signatures actually of the Protestant Declaration, and I haven't seen any woman signatures on it. So most of them, you see, would have been just the way society would have been at that time. The power rested with the men, and the most powerful would have been the peers of the realm, and their names would appear very much on it. So I'll actually have a look at that list again and examine it more closely and see are there women on it, because it would be a very good point actually. So thanks for that question.
So I think we'll just finish off, but just before we finish, just note, Tom mentioned the dueling pistols. So they're on view in the house. So go see them, please. Victoria mentioned the drawing, the idealized version of Derrynane House and the surrounds. So go and see that. It's in the hallway here. And then the chair of Daniel O'Connell, which was presented to him when he was Lord Mayor, that's on view in the drawing room upstairs. And I believe that there are some pictures of O'Mahony family members who were members of the Irish Brigade in France, where Daniel O'Connell's uncle was in charge. He was in charge of the Irish Brigade, Count Daniel O'Connell. So there's two pictures of two brothers in their red garments, red army uniforms, and they're on view in the house. So lots to see. If you have time to look, please do at all of those. Thank you all, our two speakers. Tom, we know that you can contribute lots more to discussions on local history, and Beatrice for a most informative talk on the links between Kerry and Dublin and our joint links. So thank you all very much indeed for your support. Thank you.
And thank you, Mary, for chairing the session so well. Now, it's lunchtime, and Deirdre and her team have lovely food ready for you all. If you haven't bought a ticket, they're still available just at the counter in the cafe. And to divide yourselves again between both places. As Mary said, and Adrian has given an open invitation for any of you who would wish just to walk through the house. just to walk through the house and see. There isn't a tour available, but just to feel free to walk through the house. We're going to add that it's now 1 o'clock, so we're going to resume at 2 o'clock. If everyone can be back in their places for 2 o'clock, and thank you all very much.
Agini wishle tosnomid agus bovalim fáilte curh gachéine had nash tranhona con éisteach le chlár an tranhona agus lón bra catugin stig so an mechas de Deirdre agus Drom na Bielane. Now our theme for this evening is international comparisons and contrast with O'Connell's Ireland. And we have two speakers this evening, Professor Portia Fermanis and Frank Gordon. Unfortunately, our third speaker, Professor Judith Devlin, she can't make it because she has fallen ill. So we wish her the best. So before we start, could I just give you just a gentle reminder about your mobile phones? So, Arini Wishle is Kuish Ahish agus Brodosa Falta Kur Riv our Giat Kaintor, Professor Portia Fermanis. Now, Professor Fermanis is Professor of 19th Century Literature in University College Dublin. She has published widely and extensively, and because it's so wide and extensive, I just have picked two books just to show you the range. The first book I chose to tell you about was John Keats and the Ideas of the Enlightenment. And then for the second book, she takes us all the way to the Southern Hemisphere. And the title of that, just listen to it, Public Libraries and Colonial Citizenship in the British Southern Hemisphere. So that's some range. Arini Wishle, Professor Fermanis's current interest is in empire, imperialism, and settler colonialism in the Southern Hemisphere. And that leads us on very nicely to her talk this evening, the title being Irish Humanitarians, Indigenous Australians, and Daniel O'Connell. Arini Wishle, Curigi Kiad Mila Falta, Rev. Professor Portia Fermanis.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Michal. You make me sound a lot better than I am, so I'm delighted. Thank you also to Maurice Brick for inviting me to speak today, to Mary for her absolutely seamless organisation. It's wonderful to be in Kerry. The weather is absolutely glorious, better than Australia, I'm going to put that out there. So I'm absolutely delighted. I'm going to be talking, I guess, to you about Daniel O'Connell's legacy in Australia. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Daniel O'Connell himself, and then I'm going to be moving on to a friend and colleague of O'Connell's, a man called John Hubert Plunkett, who I think deserves a lot more recognition than he's gotten to date. So in 1836, following the abolition of slavery across the British Empire, a parliamentary committee was set up in London to investigate Britain's treatment of Indigenous peoples. The committee's report, published a year later in 1837, condemned as heartless, exploitative sexual and economic practices in what they called those dark places of the earth, full of the habitations of cruelty. And by that they meant Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and South Africa. Based on interviews with 46 official eyewitnesses, including Indigenous peoples who travelled all the way from South Africa to London, so chiefs of the Khoikhoi and Xhosa tribes, the report concluded that, quote, it is not too much to say that the intercourse of Europeans in general, without any exception in favour of the subjects of Great Britain, has been a source of many calamities to uncivilised nations. So you can see that the language that the report used was very strongly condemning settlers in the British settler colonies. And what's interesting, given that we've spoken a little bit earlier about women's contribution to, say, anti-slavery debates, was that behind the scenes, a Quaker woman, Anna Gurney, actually wrote much of this report. So she wasn't officially, obviously, on the Parliamentary Select Committee, which was, 7 or 8 very well-known anti-slavery campaigners, but she did write substantial sort of parts of the report. That same year, so in 1837, the Aborigines Protection Society was established by primarily Quaker anti-slavery activists to advocate for tighter metropolitan controls over zones of settler Indigenous contact, and for the establishment of land reserves, missionary schools, and other protectionist policies. Now, it's unclear whether Daniel O'Connell was a founding member of the Aborigines Protection Society, but he was certainly present at the Society's 3rd and 4th annual meetings at Exeter Hall in London in August 1840 and on the 18th of September 1841. And on that day, in 1841, the Australasian Chronicle recorded that O'Connell gave a rousing speech and rose amidst loud cheers. O'Connell spoke of the treatment of Indigenous peoples, noting that it involved, and this is O'Connell now, more oppression and cruelty than had ever been brought before the public. Wherever the white man settles, the natives had at first been banished, then pursued, and next exterminated. There was no colony that had not participated in this exterminating guilt. And O'Connell concluded by noting that the native inhabitants of our colonies are endowed with the rights of a common humanity, in which they cannot, without the most criminal injustice, be outraged by a system of colonization not adequately compensating them for their lands or failing to secure to them the protection and privilege of British subjects. And it's quite extraordinary that in 1841, O'Connell went a lot further than many of his colleagues in saying Indigenous people should not just be protected, but they should actually be recognised for their right to own land and for their sovereignty over the land, and also as kind of equal legal subjects who should have the privilege of British citizenship and subjecthood. So it's quite astounding that that was the argument he was making in 1841. And it actually wasn't until the 1990s that Indigenous land rights were recognised in Australia. But O'Connell was noting this as early as the 1840s. For O'Connell, colonialism and oppression went hand in hand, and he argued that no other human event had led to evils so multitudinous. As this audience knows well, O'Connell was no narrow nationalist, and his important contribution to anti-slavery debates in the Americas and British policies in India is now well known thanks to Maurice Brick and other historians. O'Connell's contribution to the protection and rights of Indigenous peoples has been less explored, and I think warrants further exploration by historians. But today the story I want to tell is primarily about another Irish humanitarianism. A colleague and a friend of O'Connell's, John Hubert Plunkett, Solicitor General and then Attorney General of New South Wales in Australia from the 1830s to the 1850s. Born in Roscommon to an established Catholic family in 1802, Plunkett studied law at Trinity College, Dublin, and we won't hold that against him, and was called to the Irish bar in 1826. He was an early member of the Catholic Association, which, as we know, was sort of created by O'Connell to campaign for Catholic emancipation. Indeed, O'Connell credited Plunkett with his candidate's electoral success in Roscommon in 1830 and thanked him publicly with a dinner in Plunkett's honour. Plunkett's association with Daniel O'Connell really had a profound influence on him, and his views on the rights of all men, whatever their faith, race or origin, clearly reflected those of his mentor, Daniel O'Connell himself. Plunkett's time as a shop steward for the Catholic Association developed his administrative skills and I think politicised him as a kind of advocate for human rights. In fact, it was only because of O'Connell's success in establishing the Roman Catholic Relief Act of 1829 that Plunkett became eligible for the appointment of Solicitor General in New South Wales in 1831. And that job was actually the result of lobbying on Plunkett's behalf by Daniel O'Connell. So he was sort of lobbying his Whig friends to get Plunkett that appointment. And interestingly, this was the first appointment of a Catholic to a significant position of legal authority within the British Empire. So when he got to New South Wales, Plunkett was determined to establish equality before the law, based on the principle of what, following O'Connell, he referred to as human dignity. And this phrase comes up a lot in Plunkett's writings, both personal and sort of legal and political. He uses this phrase, human dignity, repeatedly. And he extended legal rights and protections first to convicts and servants, and then to Indigenous peoples who were not then able to give testimony as witnesses in court. Some of the Australian colonists referred to Plunkett as, quote, a slashing Irishman, full of the wildest opinions of what were the rights of people. But it was Plunkett's later involvement in a trial that really defined Australia as a nation that proved most influential. In late September 1838, Sydney newspapers began to publish what they referred to as horrible accounts of a crime at Myall Creek, a station in New South Wales about 350 miles from Sydney. And you can see on the map there that Myall Creek is basically in the Hunter Valley region of New South Wales. And there, a group of 12 stockmen had in June very violently killed around 30 Werroway people, predominantly young men, women and children, many of them in their mother's arms, in an episode of what would now be called ethnic cleansing. And here, this is the Australian Frontiers kind of conflicts map, which was created by Professor Lyndall Ryan at the University of Newcastle, which shows the number of incidences that occurred in the 19th century between settlers and Indigenous peoples. And there is the exact plot of land where the incident took place. Hidden behind a tree, only one man fully witnessed the scene that unfolded on the evening of the 10th of June, 1838. As an Aboriginal man, Davey was not able to give sworn evidence in court, but there was a detailed investigation, and later that year, 11 of the 12 men were put on trial. The ringleader unfortunately escaped and went off to India. But the trial created an enormous amount of controversy among Australian settlers because it was the first time that Europeans had been charged with the murder of Indigenous Australians. Plunkett was the prosecutor in the trial, and it involved the supreme test of his belief in equality before the law, pitting him against the views of settlers, the military, the newspapers, and the whole media infrastructure, and even the convict population, because the 11 men who had been put on trial were either convicts or former convicts. Indeed, a petition circulated to have him removed from his position as Attorney General. The petition failed, but Plunkett was for a time ostracised by colonial society after 7 of the perpetrators were convicted and hanged on the 18th of December 1838. And it's, I guess, something of an irony that Plunkett, like O'Connell, was himself opposed to capital punishment. The Sydney Herald newspaper railed against these convictions, saying it is nothing short of legal murder to take the lives of white men for the alleged slaying of blacks. But Plunkett held very firm in his belief in equality before the law. And according to the Australian barrister and historian Mark Tedeschi, who's written a kind of book-length study of Myall Creek and Plunkett's involvement in it, the approach taken by Plunkett towards the case demonstrated an enlightened and visionary attitude that was unparalleled in his time or for more than 100 years afterwards. Plunkett did not just prosecute 11 men for murder, he prosecuted his entire society for its connivance in the attempted annihilation of the Aboriginal people. And indeed, this was the only time in Australia's colonial history that any white settlers were found responsible by law for acts against Indigenous Australians. But Plunkett was not the only Irish humanitarian to respond to the Mile Creek massacre. In December 1838, Eliza Hamilton Dunlop's poem, The Aboriginal Mother, was published in the Australian newspaper several days after the 7 men were found guilty of the incident, and the poem was highly critical of settler violence. Dunlop herself was born Eliza Matilda Hamilton in 1796 in County Armagh. She was part of a privileged Protestant family. She was largely raised by her paternal grandmother and grew up reading the work of social reformers like William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft, 2 of the writers who influenced Daniel O'Connell himself. And she was deeply interested in the Irish language and supported Catholic emancipation. Following her marriage to David Dunlop from County Antrim, the Dunlops had 5 children in Coleraine, and they were engaged in political activity seeking to unseat absentee English landlords before leaving Ireland in 1837 to go to New South Wales, and they actually arrived in New South Wales a few months before the Mile Creek massacre took place. Although Dunlop was not herself an observer at the scene of the massacre, her poem was the product of her first-hand experiences as the wife of a police magistrate and protector of Aborigines. So Dunlop had taken up this role as police magistrate when he arrived in Australia. And I think she can therefore rightly be called a poet of witness, partly because her primary sources included Davies, the Aboriginal man's eyewitness account of the massacre, but also because her poem stands as a kind of textual act of witnessing of a crime. And the poem, I think, is a really important one. It ventriloquizes the voice of an Aboriginal woman, and Dunlop's aim was to kind of induce a sympathetic response from a very hostile white readership. She deliberately decided on a poem about an Aboriginal mother and child because no children had survived the massacre. And the poem is also, for its time, a radical treatment of Aboriginal subjectivity, given that many settlers believed that Aboriginal Australians were incapable of independent thought and self-expression. And I just wanted to read out the first part of the poem, which begins, "Oh, hush thee, hush, my baby, I may not tend thee yet. Our forest home is distant far, and midnight star is set. Now hush thee, or the pale-faced men will hear thy piercing wail. And what then would thy mother's tears or feeble strength avail?" So you can see that Dunlop is kind of invoking here the universal figure of the mother, the grieving mother, using the sort of natural and ostensibly pre-political nature of maternal feeling to transcend racial, cultural, and class differences. And interestingly, in her unpublished collection of poems, The Vase, the Aboriginal mother was placed next to her poem, The Irish Mother, sometimes also titled The Emigrant Mother, which ends with a cry of grief in Gaelic. And Dunlop clearly meant these poems to kind of be read together. They're sort of printed side by side in a kind of cross-cultural sharing of mourning and grief kind of across this racial divide. The poem, however, The Aboriginal Mother, also follows the Aboriginal Protection Society in emphatically rejecting fatal impact theories, attributing the vanishing of the Aboriginal people not to the sort of inevitable processes of evolution, but rather to the violent actions of the pale-faced men and their English steel. And even more strikingly, and I think this is kind of quite unique for the time, Dunlop recognises this violence as a breaking of Aboriginal culture and tradition. And this is probably something that's coming from her Irish background. She says, "Now who will teach thee, dearest, to poise the shield and spear, to wield the coupon or to throw the boomerang void of fear, to breast the river in its height, the mountain tracks to tread, the echoes of my homeless heart reply, the dead, the dead." And as you can see, she's a very accomplished poet, actually, and one who's just now being rediscovered. When she was criticised by the Sydney Herald newspaper for her poem, Dunlop very bravely responded in print by disparaging a settler culture who sought to ridicule ties stronger than death, which bind the heart of a woman, be she a Christian or a savage. And she really hoped that her poem would awaken the sympathies of the whole English nation for a people who have been rendered desperate and revengeful by continued acts of outrage. The negative publicity following the publication of the poem affected David Dunlop's career as a police magistrate, and the Dunlops were soon removed to a quite remote location in the Hunter Valley, ironically close to Mile Creek. And there too, locals campaigned against David's appointment and undermined his authority. Eliza Dunlop was later to achieve considerable fluency in the Awakabal language, and she started to translate Aboriginal literary songs and compositions. She was the first settler to do so. She transcribed and translated Indigenous songs. And even today, Aboriginal communities and linguists are using Dunlop's transcripts and word glossaries for language reclamation projects. So there are over 400 Aboriginal Australian languages, and some of them are lost. And Dunlop's glossaries are actually being used to create modern-day Aboriginal language dictionaries. So her work, sort of in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, is still now of great use. So as a long-forgotten figure, Dunlop is going through a period of recognition in Australia, as I mentioned. There's now a collected edition of her poetry, and I'm in fact just about to teach it to the first years at UCD next semester. So I'm going to be teaching the Aboriginal mother alongside the Irish mother, and a biography of her is underway. In 1856, at a dinner, the judges of the New South Wales Supreme Court paid tribute to John Hubert Plunkett's 24 years as Solicitor General and Attorney General, with the Chief Justice saying, "When the contest shall have passed away, and the voices of friendship and calumny have been like silenced by death, and the grave has closed over the generations which now know us, there will be no name recorded by the pen of history in Australian annals with juster or more endearing praise than that which belongs to Mr. Attorney General Plunkett." Unfortunately, that has not happened, and in fact, Plunkett is buried in a grave with a headstone that does not have his name on it. He has been almost completely forgotten by Australian history. And even in June of this year, Mark Tedeschi published an article in the Sydney Morning Herald noting that Plunkett was not at all known in Australia. So you can see the headline there, "True Heroes Expose the Mile Creek Massacre. To our shame, we don't know their names." So like Eliza Dunlop, Plunkett, I think, really deserves to be remembered, not just for his early friendship and connections with Daniel O'Connell, but for his transmission of O'Connell's humanitarian spirit of legal equality and human dignity to settler Australia. And I do think that influence on Plunkett was absolutely the key to what he did when he arrived in Australia. And today, Mile Creek is of huge significance to Indigenous Australians and Australians more generally. The Mile Creek Memorial was established in the year 2000 as an act of reconciliation and in acknowledgement of the truth of our shared history. It's a 23-hectare space with a granite boulder in the centre, you can see it there, which contains a plaque in memory of the victims of the massacre. And the boulder is on the top of a kind of long commemorative walkway. The shape of the walkway is in the shape of the rainbow serpent, which is part of Australian Aboriginal mythology. And at 7 intervals, there are plaques sort of recording what happened in each of the spots, with texts in both the Wirraway language and the English language. And every year in June, a ceremony is held to commemorate the Indigenous victims. Now, there is no mention of Dunlop or of Plunkett at the memorial, which is devoted to the victims, but of that, I think they would both approve. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Fernandez. That was an excellent talk, and looking at what's happening in the world today, It just illustrates again how much Donald O'Connell was ahead of his time in having that influence in the Southern Hemisphere. So it just brings another dimension to the influence of that mighty man. So, Guramila Mahavatarish. Now, Raimi de Raikurian Hiet Kaintorelle, Far Artul. That man is Frank Golden, all the way from Kells. Not Kells in County Meath, but from that lovely spot between Carsaveen and Glenbeigh. Now, Frank is a graduate of University College Cork, and he immigrated to Canada. Now, as late as yesterday, I asked him, why did you pick Canada? Because it wasn't a usual destination of immigration. And the answer he gave me was, because I couldn't get into America. So, but that was Canada's gain. And Frank is a biotechnology expert and also advises researchers in Canada and the United States on sales management. But over the years, Frank has kept in close contact with his home here in South Kerry and has a great interest in our local history and the culture of the area. And just 2 months ago, up in Kells, in his own spot in Carteen Baiters, he introduced us to a series of talks on Fenianism at home and abroad. And one of those talks focused on the links between the Fenian movement and Canada. Now today, Frank is going to take us in a different direction with his talk, which is entitled O'Connell and Canada. Avini Wishle, Kurigi Falta, Moor, Nakala, Riv, Frank Gordon.
Well, going on last, I think I must have drawn short straws because there have been some outstanding speakers, and I feel privileged to have had the opportunity to listen to them. I know I would not be able to compare with them. Thanks for that nice introduction, and part of that comes from Mirish. I think Mirish tends to exaggerate. This is the first time ever that my name and expertise was ever used in the same sentence. As I always begin with these talks, I say I'm not a historian, or I don't play one on TV. What I'm going to talk about, O'Connellism in Canada, I've accessed from a paper, and I always like to give credit to the writer. This was put together by Shane Lynn. Shane Lynn is a graduate of UCD History Department. Had the good fortune to meet a Canadian lady in Dublin. They've relocated to Toronto, took a master's under my friend David Wilson at the University of Toronto, and is now pursuing a PhD at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, and which is also connected with New York University. I have been under the divine guidance of David Wilson. Some of you who were at the Walk of the Ancestors would remember David Wilson. David Wilson is an expert. He's published 2 novels on Thomas D'Arcy McGee. I hope everybody knows who Thomas D'Arcy McGee was. I had the good fortune to attend their conference in Carlingford. Very interesting to find voices that I don't see in the media, finding loyalists from the north of Ireland who are learning to speak Irish. Also, there was input there from the business community, which was interesting. David is also an expert on Fenianism in Canada. Last year, he published this book, A Canadian Spy Story, Irish Revolutionaries and the Secret Police. I believe that there is one copy by Coleman Quirk. I hope you get Coleman to stock it. You read this, you'll find we're blessed. We have for good or bad, we have an interesting history, and it goes through the shenanigans of both the Fenians and the secret police in the north of Ireland. Well, 1829, when Catholic emancipation happened, Canada was a very sparsely populated country. 6 towns from the Ottawa Valley to the Avalon Peninsula in Newfoundland got together and formed a campaign to make that final heave for Catholic emancipation. The size of the movement was small, as a very sparsely populated country, and the epicenter of this movement, which I'm going to talk about, was in Lower Canada. And you'll hear the terms from me, Upper Canada and Lower Canada. Lower Canada today is present-day Quebec. Upper Canada is Ontario. Before we look how the movement got established in Canada, I'll tell you something about the Irish community in Lower Canada. Immigration was growing. There were about 30,000 Irish people in Lower Canada. The Irish occupied a curious position. The predominant ruling class were British. I would call them an elite. The majority of the population were French-speaking Catholics, and the Irish were a minority, which they became very adept at using to their advantage of playing both sides. So I would say that a Kerryman Jackie Healy-Rae wasn't the first one to play both sides of the aisle. Irish immigration in the 1820s, it led to the creation of the first benevolent society. And a typical St. Patrick's Day toast would be to the King, Duke of Wellington, the Armed Forces, and the Governor, Dalhousie. Within 3 years, I suppose St. Patrick's Day and a few cocktails, the toast became a little more strident. There was talk of injustice and oppression in Ireland. Daniel O'Connell's name was mentioned, and there was talk of possible separation of Ireland and England. A letter appeared on the Montreal Herald, it casting aspersions on these people who were bringing unwelcome ideas to Lower Canada. There was a retort in the form of an anonymous letter to the paper, and it read as follows: Irishmen would be the most contemptible of wretches if, after fleeing from persecution and unjust ascendancy in their own country, they should help run down and slander the Canadians in their own native land for manfully supporting their just rights. In 1828, the Irish society transformed itself from an insurance provider to the first Friends of Ireland. Local events were to be the catalyst in getting this organization off the ground. In 1822, a bill was introduced in Parliament that would merge Upper and Lower Canada on terms that were flagrantly unfavourable to Lower Canada. This was done by the business elite in Montreal and by Tories. Upper Canada had a much smaller population, but both would have equal power, so it was very unfavourable to Quebec, Lower Canada. Frequent use of the analogies in the debate, and Le Canadian asked, if this bill is passed, could they expect a fate better than Ireland? power was concentrated in a national council that was selected by the governor and by the elites. The French were very concerned about protecting their language and their culture. 200 years later, that's still an issue. 2 weeks ago, there are three great university in Montreal called McGill. It's Anglo. People come from all over the world, all over Canada to it. Concordia and Bishops. And Bishops in the Eastern Township had on faculty one time Kipling. They had their fees doubled for anybody who's going there from outside of Quebec. So Quebecers are still concerned about the language, and I lived through the language wars. Irish votes were crucial in securing wins for French in some of the elections, especially Lower Town, Quebec, and Montreal West. The French, they were delighted to have the support of these, what I call these Irish people who were English speaking, which dispelled the notion that this was about national hatreds. And now I'd go back to in 1759. I don't know if you ever heard, people are familiar with the 7-Year War. In Canada, it was known as the French and Indian Wars. In 1759, the British General Wolfe defeated Montcalm on the Plains of Abraham. The battle didn't last very long, but the outcome of that battle was Canada would be British and not French. As an aside, Wolfe said on that morning that it would be no great mischiefs if the Scottish Highlanders fell on the assault of the walls of Quebec City. I don't know if you remember what a great book that won the Dublin Impact Prize was called No Great Mischief. It got its title from this. It covered the Highland clearances of Scotland in about 1790s to settling in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, and then on to parts that cover working in hard rock mines in northern Ontario with Irish immigrants. Jocelyn Waller, who was a Tipperary Protestant, was an outspoken critic of the Union Bill. He was editor of a paper called The Canadian Spectator. And he, along with the editor of the French paper, Derrynane in Quebec City, they were charged with libel. This caused the early demise of Waller. And at his funeral, there were effusive eulogies and a request that a monument be erected to him. Trinity graduate Daniel Tracy, a doctor, was very active in the city constitution committee, which were trying to have more power devolved from the colonial authorities. Papineau, the most famous of the time of the French leaders, got elected in West Montreal with Irish support. So when in 1828 a call came from New York to support the emancipation of Irish Catholics, the population was well versed in, I'd say, liberal activism and intercommunal cooperation. United Irishmen McNevin and Sampson from New York had 3 years earlier tried to mobilize the movement. They did send an address to O'Connell's Catholic Society, but being it was deemed to be too separatist, too militant, and it was refused. And so it fizzled out. The first Friend of Ireland was established in Montreal in 1828. It mimicked Irish liberal clubs, open to all ethnicities and professions. Sister organizations were established in Quebec City, Trois-Rivières, Halifax, St. John's, and Bytown. Bytown is now known as Ottawa. Small amounts of money were collected, which is not surprising due to the area being so sparsely populated. But the Catholic Association was delighted with the moral support, claiming that it was more valuable than gold or silver, was a symbolic attestation that men are struggling for their liberty are entitled to be free. Tracy launches a paper that became the Vindicator. The Halifax branch, in an address to O'Connell, expressed the hope that the invidious distinction between Christian denominations of the empire would speedily terminate. The Nova Scotia legislature petitions to the king to dispense with the declaration against popery, which was made of a Lawrence Kavanagh, an Irish Catholic, elected to the Nova Scotia legislature, and the legislature ensured that he did not have to take the oaths that would have precluded him from taking his seat because of his religion. Patrick Morris, a prominent merchant, well known in Newfoundland, he peppered his speeches with anecdotes about Irish contributions to Canada and religious liberty prevailing in British North America. I don't know if any of you have ever been to Newfoundland, but after 4 or 5 generations, what you'll find there is a very distinct Waterford accent. I've had people in business who visited Ireland and then visited Newfoundland, and I've asked them, what did you think we call Newfoundland the Rock? What did you think of the Rock? And they said, it is more like Ireland than Ireland. Joseph Vallières, he was the Speaker of the Quebec legislature. He encouraged the French to rally for the Irish cause. He said, if the Irish are persecuted because of religion, there is no security in other parts of the empire. Political and clerical support proved to be an obstacle to loyalist opposition. 1 in 4 members in Quebec City were French, who said, if the people in Lower Canada want to help themselves, Irish and French must work together. The Tories were very happy with the involvement of the clergy because they tempered the nationalist fervour of the French Canadians. Joseph Bernard of Trois-Rivières, he said, if the Treaty of Limerick can be violated, why support the Treaty of Quebec? Treaty of Quebec was passed in 1774, gave freedom of religion to the French. Much was made of a petition in French to the king signed by the Friends of Ireland and Trois-Rivières calling for Catholic emancipation. Of the signatories, 103 were French. Now, the Friends of Ireland didn't have it all their own way. Tories did keep an eye on them in case they got too strident, but they could get away with it in Lower Canada because the authorities didn't want to rile up the French. Tracy in his paper would make comments like this: we're exiles who fled the pincers of the most terrible persecution at the hands of Britain, the most torturing enemy. Newfoundland and Nova Scotia contrasted, where they were not as militant. I will talk about Newfoundland later. Newfoundland though close to Canada, was not really connected very much to Canada until much later, and Newfoundland joined Confederation 82 years after Canada was established. Their connections in Newfoundland were primarily to Britain and Ireland. New Brunswick didn't get involved in this because in the push for Catholic emancipation. Very small population. If you had heard ever of Don Pedro I, he set up a scheme which attracted 3,000 people from Munster to get land in Brazil. When they arrived in Brazil, they found that they were supposed to be mercenaries, and they mutinied, and they left. 300 wound up in New Brunswick and were destitute. I understand that this would make a great movie. Upper Canada, present-day Ontario, very little activity. If you know your geography, Bytown, Ottawa is on the Ottawa River, is the capital of Canada. It was picked by Queen Victoria herself because she wanted a place that bordered French and English Canada. The Orange Order took root in Lower Canada in 1820, but never in Upper Canada. Not that they were indifferent to them in Lower Canada. These are the comments I find in the press. They were condemned as bloodhounds who lost all the gentler qualities of human nature. Their idols of worship were the putrid and mangled bodies and murder bodies of the people of Ireland. I hope there's nobody from the Orange Order here. O'Connell was aware of the activities of British North America, and he said, "Who emancipated the Catholics of Canada? Great Britain. Who gave civil liberty to Nova Scotia? Great Britain. Why keep Irish Catholics in chains, especially as the government has no reason to repent the acts of justice in America?" The strange fact that Catholics had more freedom in the colonies could be presented and rapidly apprehended as embarrassing the imperial government. Tracy was witnessing creation of a diasporic consciousness. Andrew Jackson, of Irish extraction, was elected president of the US. There were thoughts that probably with maybe American support, Irish independence could be levered. Tracy was not the first, and he wouldn't be the last to take advantage of disputes between Britain and the United States. 1829, emancipation. Celebrations in Lower Canada that nothing like the celebrations, and I'll talk about Newfoundland afterwards. Newfoundland had a very large Irish population, about 70,000 Irish people there, and on the Protestant side there were about 30,000. These would have been a British stock. The celebrations it electrified the community in Newfoundland. They had massive celebrations. The Irish Bishop Fleming, was a personal friend of O'Connell and a great supporter. So after emancipation in Lower Canada, the societies dissolved. And when Connell was arrested and the news reached, there was a feeling that emancipation was wasted in pursuit of a shadow. The Friends of Ireland were resuscitated, but they quickly fizzled out. And in Lower Canada, why? There was no extra parliamentary movement on their way into which the diaspora could latch onto. And local events were having a bigger impact. From 1830 to 1834, 180,000 Irish landed in Quebec. Many were sick, they were destitute. 6,000 died of cholera in Lower Canada. And the Quebec City population at that time was 30,000. Tracy dies of cholera too. At that time, a quarantine station is established in Gros-Île, which would be of great significance during the famine. I don't know, anybody here have been to Gros-Île? I'll tell you about Gros-Île. It was the Ellis Island of Canada, as an aside. I went there for the first time 40 years ago on a very wet Sunday morning. You'll see the mass graves there. There are 5,000 there in this clump. There's a magnificent, huge Celtic cross there. The Celtic cross, interesting, has 3 inscriptions on it. In English, it says people who wanted to come but found a grave in America. The French pays attention to the work their priests done, which they did, and there's a famous priest, Taschereau, statue to him in Quebec City, who went out of their way to help the immigrants. And then you look at the Irish inscription, and then you know what they were really thinking. They said they were there because of the unjust laws that were inflicted on them by the occupier of their country. I'll come back to that later. Gros-Île at one time was in the 80s was going to be turned into an amusement park. There was a massive backlash in America. Even the Reagan White House got involved because this is sacred ground to a lot of Irish Americans. Then, of course, in the 1830s, the Irish and French communities began to diverge. The Irish want their own churches. The French clergy are not happy with this. The influence of European revolutions at the time, and the French Catholics are becoming more radical. As a lot of Irish began to improve, they become more conservative, and they defected to the Tories. And then with this massive immigration, for the time being, the Irish abandoned the nationalist cause to assist the destitute migrants from Ireland. So now we're going to leave and we go to 1840 to Newfoundland. Catholic emancipation didn't mean the same in Newfoundland as it did in the rest of the colonies. At the time, you had about 70,000 Irish Catholics who had two Catholic magistrates. You had about 30,000 Protestants who had about 30 magistrates. Power was vested in the government. So there was a demand for devolution of power. And it looked like it was going to happen. But in 1840, the Tories took power and they rejected all of it. And in comes Daniel O'Connell. He objected to all the articles in the House of Parliament, saying this was transfer of power to the aristocracy. It was most unfortunate, but it passed. In the 1840s, mid-1840s, there was a major fire in St. John's, and a lot of people were destitute. Daniel O'Connell sent £20 to his friend, Bishop Fleming. So the Irish in Canada, if I tell you a little about Canada, in the low 20%, about 24% of the Canadian population is of Irish extraction. If you visit the House of Commons in Ottawa, you'll find from there that the four founding peoples are English, Scottish, Irish, and the native people. And as the immigration increased, so did another form of political activity. But one of those who did come to Canada as a rebel, who escaped, Thomas D'Arcy McGee, evolved into a constitutional politician that Daniel O'Connell would be proud of. He was Minister for Agriculture in the first Canadian government, the government headed by John A. Macdonald from Glasgow. In early 1868, he was assassinated in Ottawa, the only Canadian politician to be assassinated. Still has family in the area. During the Fenian movement, there was a harebrained scheme to invade Canada, and it featured a local man from Keele-McKiernan called Mortimer Moriarty. Moriarty was active here in South Kerry, and after getting out of prison, went back to Canada. People who built the Celtic Cross were the Gallagher brothers from Macroom. They supported the Irish Party, but they hedged their bets. They also supported the dynamite campaign of O'Donovan Rossa. And of the Gallaghers, I did meet a granddaughter. She was a nun, passed away now, Mariana, and she tried to keep the legacy of the Fenians and of the Gallaghers alive. We can come on then to Canada. Canadian politicians resigned and ran for the Irish Party. 1916, Louis Saint Laurent said he was devastated by the executions. He appealed for leniency. After that, and then we come to the present day, to the Troubles, and there was activity in Canada. Gerry Adams who was not allowed to address the media in Britain, was allowed into Canada. And the next person I'll finish up with, who I went to see, was Albert Reynolds. A lot of people don't realize that there's a tremendous residue of goodwill towards Ireland, both in Canada and the United States. And after the ceasefire was announced, I believe in 1995, I happened to be in Vancouver, and there was Albert Reynolds had packed the main auditorium at the University of British Columbia. I went with the hotel manager, and we got to meet Albert, and Albert had opened a heritage center for one of my brothers, and my niece had played the harp for him. He remembered it. I know Irish politicians are always opening liquor stores and supermarkets. And I said, "You had a couple of fuckle for us." Later, there was a reception that night at one of the faculty clubs, and a lady came up to me in a very posh Dublin 4 accent, and she said, "Excuse me, sir, why were you asking Mr. Reynolds about a couple of fuckers?" I told that story to Pat Quinn, who founded Quinsworth, ended up in Toronto, and it was a great friend of Albert's. He assured me that Albert would know more than a couple of the aforementioned. So that is a synopsis of O'Connellism in Canada. If anybody wants access to the paper by Shane Lynn, I think I'll give it to Mary, and you'll be able to access it, or I will email it to you. So, thank you for your attention.
Gurmila Mahagat Frank, thanks for those details on Canada and how initially they were gave a bit of ammunition to O'Connell in his fight for emancipation. So Gurmila Mahagat Arish. Now, Kishtina, any questions? Or Mary, anybody have any questions to the two speakers? Paddy? Yeah, Paddy.
Yeah, a question for Professor Fermani. She illustrated very well the resistance from the colonial establishment to, the ideas were three protagonists. What would they, or perhaps what does she make of the result of the recent referendum in Australia?
Thank you. That's an excellent question and a difficult one to answer for me, because on the one hand, we've had a referendum and the voice of the people has spoken. But I will now speak on a personal level and say that I think it was a real missed opportunity for the recognition of our First Nations people, who really had put forward a very modest proposal, which was that they should be recognised as the First Nation people, a single line in our constitution that would then guarantee them what they called a voice in Parliament, which was really just an advisory body, and that would have no sort of legislative impact beyond that. So I think that was an incredibly modest proposal. The other thing that I think made this a missed opportunity was that it really did come from Indigenous communities themselves. So Indigenous communities wrote a statement called the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which they offered as a gift to non-Indigenous Australian people. So it was what they called makarata, a gesture of reconciliation, which unfortunately was not reciprocated at the referendum. And I think the sad thing about that is that Australia is the only settler nation that hasn't recognised its First Nations people in the Constitution. So in New Zealand, First Nations people have been recognised in the Constitution since the 1860s, and there was a Maori Parliament, even sort of Maori members of Parliament guaranteed even earlier than that. In Canada, Indigenous people have had constitutional recognition. So for me personally, it was a day where we could have righted some of our history. At the same time, as our Prime Minister said, we have to respect the results of a referendum. But like the referendum on the Australian Republic, I hope that it will come round again and that we will have a second opportunity to make that right. So thank you for that question.
Anyone out in the AV room? Anybody in the AV room?
Yes, we have a question.
Yeah, a question from Mr. Golden. I was just wondering, the Irish politician who was assassinated in Canada, why was he assassinated and who assassinated him, please?
If David Wilson's here, I'll give you his answer first. David would say buy second volume of his book. The Fenians were active. D'Arcy McGee had evolved from being a militant young Irelander to a constitutional politician, and he thought that militant revolutions were not helpful to the Irish situation, that they should pursue their goals through Parliament. Well, going back to his place of residence in 1868, he was shot dead. There was a person convicted of it who was from Liverpool, of Irish extraction, and it was thought that he might have been connected to the Fenians. There's no evidence that he was connected to the Fenians, and David Wilson thinks that he was convicted, possibly in the wrong, of on very circumstantial evidence. If you find about, my history with police, they like cases to be closed. Don't let anybody hanging. Don't let anything hanging. Usually, it's somebody convicted. They did something, but they didn't commit that crime. And too often in North America, it's happened that people who were innocent doesn't mean they were squeaky clean. They've been convicted of the wrong crime. So there's a lot of controversy over that. But certainly the Fenian movement was not happy with D'Arcy McGee condemning the militancy. Also, let's remember that at the end of the Civil War, you had an awful lot of Irish veterans. A lot of people don't realize Irish veterans fought for the North, but they've also fought for the South. And there was movements afoot to invade Canada. They were going to attack Campobello Island and create an international incident. And so remember, at the time, the relationship between the US and Great Britain after the Civil War was not good. The problem was the cotton producers in the South, which the South needed to finance their side in the Civil War. Britain kept buying the cotton for the mills in Manchester. There was also a raid by some military people from Eastern Canada into the New England states. So I hope that answers your question. Well.
Thanks, just Mark Bovalum Gormechus Achararish Dar Mert Kaintori, Professor Portia Fermanis, and Frank Gordon. So Bulabas Mordor.
Thank you very much, and thank you, Michal, for chairing that session. Well, I have a very simple task, just to, over about a minute, is it I have, Mary, or 2 minutes even, just to thank everybody who participated in the school. One of the things that often comes up when we have these international papers is that people invariably ask, when did O'Connell go to Australia, or when did he go to America, or when did he go to Canada, or when did he go to Spain? And of course the answer is that, with the exception of France, he never went to any of these countries. And it's always extraordinary, and I think Portia mentioned this, it's always extraordinary that despite the fact that he didn't go to these countries, that his ideas were still powerfully transmitted and had such a formative effect, even in an Australian courtroom. And in its own context, that was as powerful as any of the meetings he held here to address more parochial or more national or more local issues. So really, like, the more and more I hear about this O'Connell man, the more and more extraordinary. Even at this hour of my life, and with all of the research I've done on O'Connell, I still absolutely find him as an absolutely extraordinary man, and whose dimensions really we have still don't understand. And partly because he's such a difficult man himself, to figure out. There was
statement made in the Dáil in the 1930s, I think was by James Dillon. When I think it was James Dillon, I might have the reference wrong. But anyway, somebody asked him what he thought about De Valera, who was his great nemesis, and I think I probably have now. I'm looking down at Brandon Kivine now. I think I might have the reference wrong, but Brandon, I think, could correct me. But anyway, he said he's like picking up mercury with a fork. You think you have him figured out, and then it kind of dissipates away. But you know, O'Connell is a bit like that, and of course he's all the more interesting and all the more powerful for that. And he's so many dimensions to him, whether they're international or whether they're direct or indirect, or the influence of literature that Paddy Bush spoke about yesterday, and so forth. I mean, he's just such a powerful presence, despite the fact he may not be physically present or have the experience of actually visiting these places. His influence is nonetheless powerful even without that. Anyway, that's all by the way. I hope you've enjoyed the lectures over the last 2 days. I certainly have. As I said earlier, when I was commenting on Victoria's paper, O'Connell and Derrynane is a place I think I know a bit about, and every time I hear papers, I realise how little I know. So actually, this is one of the great advantages of a school like this. You know, one can see O'Connell and his impact from so many different perspectives, and take a great deal of enjoyment and satisfaction from it. Anyway. That's that, and I hope we'll see you next year. But before I leave, I have a friend, well, I have a number of friends, but I have one friend who's out in the other place. And I mentioned this last year, but I'm going to mention it again this year because I know he's there this year, but he wasn't last year. Anyway, I met him last year at the end of the school, and I was asking him what he thought of the school and what he thought of the lectures. And he was a bit kind of agitated and a bit kind of upset. I said, why are you upset? And he said, the lectures are great, he said, and you're great, he said, and Mary O'Connor is great, everybody is great, he said, but you don't ask people for money and you don't ask them for support. And I said, well, despite the fact, I said, that I talked to the Carrick-Carsevine Church last night, I don't feel like a priest, as I feel like I don't really like asking for people for this kind of support. But what he said, I'm not asking you to go out and make an appeal or public appeal or anything, but just to remind people that on our website, we do invite people to become friends of the school and to contribute to the to the way in which we finance these things. And I'm just reiterating that because I don't like my friend to be upset. And as I say, he's out there this year, so I really don't want him to be upset. So in his name, if not my own, I'm just reminding you that on our website there is provision to become a member of a friend of the Daniel O'Connell School. And rather like Daniel O'Connell, when we were kind of concocting this, we said, well, how much are we going to ask? Now, we can't ask too much, people think we're too greedy, and we can't ask too little, because if we do, people think it's not worth joining in the first place. So we decided we'd let it open to people. And rather like O'Connell, you know, when he launched his Catholic Rent, he had a penny a month, but then he kind of said, or for the better off, they could give as they see fit, you know. So we please don't be shy, and please don't be cautious in kind of interacting with us. The website is open 12 months a year, so you don't have to do it tomorrow, but we'll be monitoring them for the next 3 or 4 weeks. So Mary O'Connor wanted to do this, but you know, she's a bit shy about these things. She says, you can do it, Maurice, you did it much better. So in honor of Mary O'Connor and my friend out in the other places, please, we look forward to hearing from you in the next. Thank you very much, and a safe journey home, and I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.